Clear eyes, full hearts. Can't lose.
That's right. I think we have to pour one out for former fan favorite Laviska Chenault.
So sad.
Jacob, I know it's hard for you. You're a big fan, but hey, this is the Full Tilt Dynasty podcast. Good vibes are ahead. This is episode 8, and we do have with us today Ben Gretch. Look, lots to get into today. This is going to be a lot different conversation stylistically than we normally have, and we're looking forward to bringing it to you. Of course, this is the Full Tilt Dynasty podcast presented by Underdog Fantasy. I am your host with the most time in his hands. I am Thomas Tipple. You can find me at Thomas Tipple FF. And I just want to say shout out to one bad guy, Scott Hall.
I'm Jacob Sanderson, although I don't even know how you tell me and Tom apart now that he's shaved all of his facial hair off and looks so suave. But you can find me on Twitter, FF_RTDB. And a fun fact is that Zay Jones is now the highest paid wide receiver in the NFL from a college in North Carolina.
All right, that's a good one. I'm Billy. You can find me on Twitter at BigBillyFF. Darnell Mooney's second year is eerily similar to DJ Chark's second year.
I hope it goes better for you, buddy.
Maybe he could get paid $10 million by the Lions when his rookie contract is up. Of course, as I mentioned, our star-studded guest lineup continues with the only analyst with a rival claim to Jacobs when it comes to who actually posts more AJ Brown, Dolce and Gabbana pictures in league chats most often. The author of the Stealing Signals newsletter, co-host of Stealing Bananas and Ship Chasing. This is Ben Gretch.
What's up, guys? Thanks for having me on. Yeah, you guys are telling me you have these fun facts. Yours were all about football. I was just going to say I'm taking my wife and 10 and 6-year-old daughters on a 9-day road trip in like 2 weeks. So that's my fun fact for today.
There we
fun.
go.
Where are you going?
We need that.
All around the West Coast to southern Utah, to Bryce Canyon and Zion National Park, to the Grand Canyon, to Vegas, down to LA, hit up Disneyland, come back up the coast through past the Golden Gate Bridge. Gonna check a lot of boxes. We've been indoors for a couple of years, so gonna check a lot of boxes. Got some sights to see. Great timing too. I mean, we planned this before the war, and now gas prices have risen. Yeah. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
What's the Vegas experience like with a full family in terms of being someone who works in gaming and gambling?
I mean, I'm not gonna get to do anything fun. we're just kind of rolling through to see the sights. I want to show the kids the hotels and the buildings and stuff. They'll think some of that stuff's cool. My wife's super excited to play the slots. I'm gonna try to sneak down to the sports book, after they're in bed. But like, there probably won't even be anything to bet on at that time.
What's the conversation?
Preseason baseball? I don't know.
What's the conversation for you as like someone who talks constantly about like probabilistic thinking, making smart bets, whatever, and then your wife says like, I'm really excited to play the slot machines. Like, how do you respond to that? Like, do you send her a newsletter or?
Dude, opposites attract, man.
Papers.
She does not care about probabilistic thinking.
That's amazing. Look, Ben, we like to kind of briefly go over the day's happenings, even though it's been tweeted about, talked about, already potted about, 672,000 plus times by people that are, smarter than most of us in this room. But just for listeners' sakes, we like to kind of go through a do we care portion of the day's news, kind of pick our favorite thing that might have happened or come up today that you don't think has been totally beaten to death at this point. So with today's news or even yesterday's free agency starting, was there something that has stuck out to you enough that really makes you truly care at this point of the process, or kind of not?
Oh, there's a ton of, there's a lot, right? I mean, it's free agency week. The one I would say that maybe hasn't been beaten to death is I thought Russell Gage to Tampa Bay was pretty interesting. I mean, he's a guy that I wasn't really high on last year. And then early this offseason, his ADP has actually been lower in, early best ball stuff. mainly because he got hurt. But despite the fact that he actually improved in some pretty key metrics, he was actually drawing volume at a much better rate. But he didn't have really any target competition. I mean, other than, you have turning 21-year-old Kyle Pitts and basically no one else for most of the season.
Yeah.
Especially when he was playing later in the year and putting up some target numbers. And so he's an interesting one. I think that sort of the low key part of it that I do think is interesting is like last year was sort of a peak for him in terms of target volume. And I already have written this offseason that maybe I was a little too harsh earlier to quickly label him just a guy. At the same time, now he's going to like an incredibly crowded target room. And so sort of the low key part of it for me is like, I don't think people realize how good Antonio Brown was per route necessarily. His targets per route have been ridiculous the last few years. Just replacing that is an advantage for Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, and assuming Gronk's back for the rest of the offense. Like those guys could actually do a little bit more than they've been able to over the last couple of years. And replacing it with Gage, Gage has some upside, if you will. And when I say upside, I mean upside to be a little bit of a nuisance to those guys. But there's also this possibility that Gage is just sort of not really that big of a detriment to those guys at all. Regardless, I think it's definitely a positive for Evans, and when Godwin's healthy, for Godwin
I think those guys are all fascinating because, and I think they've been fascinating for a while because they've just continually, like, honestly just owned me because they've been like Evans and Godwin have both just been crushing their per route usage for years now. Like they're like Godwin's like on just a per route basis, like it doesn't look great. He's like sitting in like the low 20s in target share. I think he was like at 19% in air yard share. Like it's a profile where if you take away the name and the context of the situation and what he can do after the catch, like it looks kind of like a wide receiver 3. And then you add in this like high volume passing game, high efficiency passing game. He's just really skilled when he gets the ball. And these guys have been putting up these low end wide receiver 1 numbers. And I was predicting kind of a crash this year. And then Brady comes back. And of course, like now we're back in season. But you're right. Like AB was arguably like the best wide receiver in the NFL last year, like per route when you consider the target competition. Like he was really, really good. So
just championship weekend.
My
couldn't wait until after.
Yeah, championship weekend was like he caused me like significant monetary harm with his actions that weekend.
I traded a second for him like the week prior. Is very upsetting.
What a win.
I just wish Godwin didn't tear his ACL, man, because like the way you just described that, I completely agree with. But there is that element of like there's been a lot of competition, and the guy that Godwin to me, I won't say he resembles because it's silly to predict this outcome, but like if you're looking for the next Cooper Kupp, like Chris Godwin would have been a really good pick for that if he hadn't torn his ACL, in the sense that without Brown in the mix, he actually took a step forward in targets per route run a little bit last year. Still not great, like you said, and that's sort of what the deal was with Kupp. Evans kind of took a step back. Like I think there's a little bit of a gap between those two finally, where Godwin was sort of the better of the two, and he's younger, and if he doesn't tear his ACL with Brown gone, there's this potential that he has this monster step forward year. It's tougher with the injury.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think Mike Evans has been declining for like 4 years now. Just people don't seem to want to take notice.
Fantasy points, so it's
exactly.
But Jacob, what is it from the last day or so that has stuck out to you the most that you don't think has totally been beat to death by the Bird app?
My takeaway is that 1 million wide receivers are going to get drafted in the first 2 days. Like we've seen just like really replacement, like Zay Jones is a replacement level, like wide receiver. Like Christian Kirk is like a really good wide receiver 3. He's a good wide receiver 2. He's definitely not a wide receiver 1. Like we're seeing what's rumored for Marquez Valdes-Scantling. Like we've seen either like average or good like receivers, and some guys like an MVS, for instance, like a guy who's like just like more of a helpful NFL player by running these clear out routes and stuff than he'll ever be for fantasy. But these guys are going to get jammed. I mean, we've seen now in the last while, like teams went from being predominantly 12 personnel with mixes of 3 wide receiver sets, and now teams are going constantly 3 wide receiver sets. There's teams like the Bills last year that were running 10 personnel, like I think like 40% of plays. Cardinals have used a lot of 10 personnel recently, probably less so with Ertz. but more teams are embracing like 11 and 10 personnel groupings and rotating wide receivers. I think that we're going to see 6 on day 1 of the draft. I wouldn't even be totally shocked if a Christian Watson or a George Pickens somehow snuck into the back end. And I think we could see like 14, 15 by the end of day 2, just with how much of a priority teams are putting on filling their wide receiver group. And we saw it with the 2 teams that ended up in the Super Bowl, right? Like in the Rams, they had always been doing these 11 personnel offenses with Woods and Kupp, and it was Cooks, it was Watkins, then it became Odell Beckham and everyone's favorite Van Jefferson. And then, the Bengals basically took the Rams approach, right? And they adopted it, and they went like 3 really good wide receivers. Like Tyler Boyd, I make fun of him for fantasy, but like he's a really good wide receiver. And I think that's what we're going to see is this draft. Like teams are going to just jam this position.
And I'm going to piggyback off of yours. And before we get to Billy, I just want to note that what the wide receivers getting paid right now are kind of getting overblown. Like even if you look at Kirk's contract, they have an out. I think it's after year 2 to get out of his contract. He's only guaranteed $37 million of the 80 of the 72. But like when you look at that contract and how it was talked
about, you're saying he's here for a good time, not a long time.
That's a fifth of Aaron Rodgers.
Right. I understand that, but Aaron Rodgers is actually worth his. So when it comes to how much fire that contract lit all across Twitter, it made it seem like it was just a fully guaranteed, like Kirk Cousins level thievery, but it wasn't. So I think that you're right.
I would argue that it still was. At 2 years and $37 million guaranteed, it's still going to be a massive overpay. Like,
I agree. But it's just not as bad, maybe. And then, of course, once the first news hit, then it was the next receiver, and oh my God, they overpaid for that, and they did. But I think it's setting up what Jacob had said. These receivers are going to become even more important come draft night, and then especially come week 4, 5, when some of these receivers are starting to overtake these overpaid free agents, and things start to set in a little bit more. I think there's going to be value to be had for trading for some of these guys in season if you don't get them at the draft, because they're going to get put behind these free agents, Kadarius Toney and Kenny Galladay.
Like Zay Jones is definitely going to be the Ollie BC Johnson to whatever wide receiver Jacksonville drafts at the top of round 2. Like,
exactly,
that's going to happen. They're going to draft someone. They're going to draft like George Pickens at pick 33,
Billy,
and then Olabese and Zay Jones. I literally just did it to myself. Zay Jones is going to be like trotting out there for 70% of the routes week 1, and people are going to get really mad. It'll turn. It'll turn eventually.
Yes, and so just relax. Don't follow the money. Don't trade first for Christian Kirk because he's high paid. Relax.
Please, to me though. Please trade me a first for Christian Kirk because I have him on a lot of rosters.
I know you do. That was your boy in 2019. Billy, what do you have?
Sticking with the wide receiver theme here, I think it's really interesting that some of the better wide receivers are kind of just sitting on the sidelines. Like last year with the with free agency, I remember there was like a couple days after the main like wave of free agency before Kenny Galladay signed his big contract, and it feels like we're kind of seeing the same thing this year. But I don't think it's because of a lack of spending, as we're seeing right now. I think it's a lot more teams are waiting to see how this QB market settles. Because all of a sudden, some of the better quarterbacks in the league that were available to be on the move are now in Denver for the foreseeable future and Green Bay for the foreseeable future. And now, like teams like Carolina, teams like the Saints, they have a lot of opening for the wide receiver position. But who's throwing them the ball? And it seems like a lot of teams right now are exactly Boots getting there before I'm able to. A lot of these wide receivers are waiting to see on where Deshaun Watson ends up.
I mean, Fuller for sure, right? Like Fuller feels like a package deal.
Yeah.
You're just hoping like that's.
I mean, we know they're tight. Like it's happening.
Yeah. No, 100%. Just like, for example, when it comes to the Christian Kirk contract, it's eerily similar to what Kenny Galladay signed with the Giants. So, yeah, relax.
Yeah, but Galladay had
on his hype. Oh well, Jacob, He's trashing your boy Kirk here for Kenny Galladay. I don't know if that's allowed. Look, that's gonna do for whatever news. We have a lot to get to.
Yeah.
A lot of it is strategy and different ways of thinking. So I want to hit all of that. We're gonna take a second. We're going to take a peek at our show with Pat Dougherty, and when we come, give you a break from our voices. When we come back, we're gonna get into some of the real meat of the episode here. You're not gonna want to miss it. So sit tight.
I tweeted what I thought was a fairly obvious joke where I tweeted NFL investigators. I tweeted it like the style of like a serious New York Times article. I tweeted NFL investigators did conclude that Mr. Ridley used no inside information when he bet $100,000 that Matt Ryan would take a third down red zone sack in the fourth quarter of the Falcons' Week 17 loss to the Bills. And it's gone like stratospheric on Twitter where like everyone thinking it's real. And I'm like, is this lawyer going to see this and like come like sue me and like defamation or something? Like I thought it was like a very clear parodic post, but like so many people now are tweeting as if it's real. And I'm scared, Jake.
How does it feel to have that kind of influence on legal matters?
That's the fear of Twitter.
I'm
Twitter
scared.
does not understand sarcasm. Really what it comes down to here is it's actus reus and mens rea, and the mens rea was clearly sarcasm.
God, that was such fun. You can
What
catch
happened to
that
that?
episode on YouTube.
You guys weren't kidding about the beard. I mean, who was that guy?
Different person.
Who was that guy in that clip?
My wife hasn't seen it yet either, so it'll be a fun interaction when that happens.
Oh no.
It's a very different look. All right, Ben, this is the part that Tom made fun of me on the show sheet for my fanboy hour. But yeah, like I don't mean it, I very much mean it when I say like you've been one of the most influential analysts on a lot of my work and my writing. I want to just like read out a passage that I really enjoyed. It was after the Travis Etienne injury, but it was from Some Thoughts on Anti-Fragility, and I've quoted this piece before in one of my articles. It says a full season projection is something like that central timeline, and you're referring to, I think, Loki. That's what's least imaginable in the NFL season is the timeline not branching. Things are going to happen, and you talked about this concept of anti-fragility. When we target anti-fragile players, what we're targeting is players whose fantasy outlook will improve almost no matter what the shakeup or disorder is, and that's coming from the work of Taleb. What do you mean for people when you say like target anti-fragile players? What is the kind of archetype of players? Because it's never going to be just one guy. But like one of the things I love about hearing some of you and Sean's work is like, well, if we just eliminate these kind of guys that don't fit the archetype of what we want, then we give ourselves like a lot more swings at the kind of guys who can work. Even if that's not necessarily the guys we're projecting the highest. What are those archetypal factors you really look for to target?
Yeah, I mean, that piece was about Etienne right after he got hurt, but we didn't have the news yet on his injury. And part of the point I was going to make or did make in that piece was before the injury, he was set up in this position where his redraft ADP especially was lower almost strictly because of situation. He went one pick after Najee Harris, and people thought the Najee Harris workload looked so much better that Harris was going like 3 full rounds higher in these key rounds, right? Najee Harris was going second round. Etienne's going in the 5th. And Etienne's arguably a better prospect coming into last year. And my argument was basically no matter what happens, Etienne is in position, went before his injury, was in position to like improve his situation because we're already starting from like a really poor projection of a first round pick. You have the draft capital associated with it. You have all of those things. So like if James Robinson gets hurt or if Etienne flashes in limited snaps or whatever, like things are going to work his way. The other guy I mentioned in that piece a lot was Jamar Chase because that was right when his drops were a huge issue and his ADP was falling. And I was saying they're not going to bench him for his drops. And if he has drops issues week 1, they're going to give him more shots. They did. I think the reference I made was Jonathan Taylor back in 2020 where he didn't hit right away early in the season. And then mid-season, they kind of pulled him back a little and then they let him loose again later in the year. Like these teams have invested in these guys. And so in the context of that piece, I was definitely talking about these young players, obviously, that include draft capital, and we're looking at it from a redraft perspective. I love targeting rookies, young players that the team has shown us they're high on with the draft capital. We like them from a dynasty perspective, from a prospect perspective. But they're being pushed down because of sort of the full season projection, the projections, whatever you want to call it, industrial complex. Like that we get once the projections come out, it's brutal. It's like, this guy's not going to get enough touches. And the whole point that you mentioned in the piece is this idea that like things going to plan is more or less the least likely scenario. There's a few teams where things ultimately go to plan, but if you spend any amount of time going back and looking at past seasons and considering what, or have knowledge of what we were thinking might happen in that season for that team coming in August, there's a ton of factors that lead to it. But ultimately, the seasons don't play out the way that we're projecting them. And there's a lot of weight in terms of, redraft ADP, especially, that's applied to full season projections. So yeah, I mean, like the type of player, I'm looking at young players. Another one that I love is looking at crowded position groups. The Bengals receiver room was a great one last year. They were all being pushed down because there was 3 of them. I was taking Tyler Boyd, I was taking T. Higgins, and I was taking Jamar Chase. The Cowboys was the other one that had 3 where it didn't really pan out, but I still want to take that those opportunities where the guy's being pushed down just because there's not enough targets to be allocated when we do a full season spreadsheet. And I'm as big of a data nerd as anyone, but that's part of why I know this. I've done this, the projections, and I know that I'm pushing guys lower than where I want them to be in terms of target share when I'm projecting them, because I have to project targets to their teammates. But I think this dude's really good. And if his teammate ends up getting hurt, but I also think his teammate's really good, and I'm pushing his numbers down as well. And so it's a situation where you're like, okay, well, I think all these guys are good. His offense is probably just going to be good. But if any of them gets hurt, the other ones are now in a scenario where this exact thing I'm thinking about when I'm doing this projection would look way different. And I'd be bumping everyone else way up because I'd be able to get to the numbers that I want to get to. And so it becomes this, backwards math problem where I'm like, well, if I did remove one player from an injury, I mean, things are going to go great. So the crowded positional rooms, broadly with anti-fragility, like the simple thought that I always keep in mind is this idea of like small miss, big hit. And so like when you talk about like the crowded position groups, their guys are always valued close to their floor essentially. And there's still a lot of room for this big hit. There's not a lot of like putting aside major injury, which is always a factor. There's not a lot of room in those situations for them to be like big misses at their ADP. Meanwhile, you talk about guys that are pushed up because they're the only target option in their offense, or we think that they're going to be the target hog. Kenny Golladay, we were just talking about, it's a good example. Like there was a lot of concerns there. There's a lot of long-term data about receivers switching teams. I had concerns about how Daniel Jones would fit with him, but people were like, what competition does he have? Like coming into the year, Sterling Shepard was not being respected at all. Kadarius Toney, absolutely no consideration in redraft. Darius Slayton completely off the board for people. It was like, okay, Galladay's now, Evan Ingram, everyone had forgotten about and given up on. It's like Galladay's going to come and he's going to be the alpha number 1. Well, that was kind of more of a small hit to me where I didn't really see the huge ceiling and big miss type of player. So sort of the inverse, where the projections are pushing him up or projecting him to be this alpha that we don't know that he can be. And there's this potential that he's just not in this offense. I mean, there's enough that has changed. So that's kind of the too long didn't read for me. The TLDR would be like small miss, big hit players is what I'm trying to define. It's always tough though. I mean, like you're referencing my work, that I wrote about tacit knowledge and like this idea that it's like a lot of these concepts are not, I mean, what I'm trying to do in my newsletter is like help explain things that are sometimes hard to explain, but those are the best ways I can try to frame those.
No, I love it. And like 100%, like I can say without a doubt, Tom will make fun of me after the show for fanboying, but like what I'm like my series this year for Player Profiler that I'm working on called Thinking About Thinking would literally not exist if it wasn't for your newsletter. Like a lot of like just trying to focus on like conceptual, broader strategic points.
That's cool.
I did.
I mean, I appreciate that. That's very cool.
Okay.
I take that positively, obviously.
I appreciate you appreciating it. I did have.
Take it easy.
Well, I appreciate you appreciating that I appreciated it.
We're just all gonna start crying by the end of this hour.
Yeah, I had an emotional day at work, so I could be close. No, I wanted to pick up on a couple things there. Like this is a point that I've made a lot in the Discord, the Bulletproof Discord, is with regards to the Ravens guys. Like I've notably, like, I guess a little bit more optimistic on Bateman than his rookie season should lead me to be. And also, like, I think Andrews is really good. And I've been really, really high on Hollywood Brown because he was a guy who was top 12 in expected fantasy points per game last year, whoppers through the roof, draws a lot of targets. 2 years in a row, he's drawn a lot of targets on a per route basis, and on an overall share basis. And people are like, how can you be high on all these? Like, I do think that there's more risk with the Ravens this year, certainly than last year. But I was like, I think they're going to pass a lot more. And if they didn't, then they would just meet everybody's expectations. Like this year, the expectations are higher. But I think it's an example where, and this certainly isn't the only one, but I think people extrapolate positions too much across guys. Like Debo and Ayuk could be an example last year. Like I was really, really bullish on Ayuk last year. In hindsight, clearly too bullish on Ayuk last year. But I still think then when we look at Debo, like I also was pretty over market on him in terms of my exposure, because I think it's fair enough to say when you're looking at Ayuk in a vacuum and say, okay, what's his case? Well, part of it is like that Debo is kind of a running back in terms of like how he was used the previous 2 years. And Ayuk earned all these targets. He's the alpha. Let's roll. Like that's our ceiling case for Ayuk. Then you look at Debo. Like I don't think you have to carry over the Ayuk ceiling case as an expectation when you look at Debo. I think you can include in his range of outcomes. What if Ayuk doesn't meet those expectations? Similar with Hollywood Brown. Like I think it's fair to say in a vacuum that we can be optimistic about Rashad Bateman taking a major step forward when we're looking at Bateman. But then looking at Brown, say, yeah, it's also possible that Bateman just like isn't that good. And he's just like a wide receiver too, who has an 18% target share. And like, maybe that's possible. And I don't think that's necessarily hedging against yourself when you're doing it across multiple different teams. Like, I think we can like aspects of that ambiguity and see elements of the ceiling there.
I would go a step further and say that I think people should be doing that more. I mean, I think that's a really sharp thing to be thinking through. I sometimes use this phrase that, or not really a phrase, but I just hate this idea of like, who's the number one receiver? Like that always gets talked about everywhere in real NFL discussion. Who's their real number one? Like whenever there's a team that has multiple good receivers. And my thing is always like, number one, like it doesn't matter in most of these offenses because there are multiple productive receivers. You're talking about how offenses are going into more 3 and 4 wide receiver sets. Like that's not a position where there has to be a number one. There's multiple good players, on a lot of these teams. But secondly, I want to analyze the players independently. And so like, I don't want to knock somebody in relation to his teammate in that discussion. Oh, he's not as good as his teammate. Like, well, if you definitely want to think holistically as far as I'm concerned. And if the offense is one that I want to be targeting for other reasons, for potentially real football reasons, whatever, I might be very excited about the number. Like, I mean, we can go into who's the number one thing in the Bengals. Like, I think probably Jamar Chase is the number one now, but I still want to be all over T. Higgins. I'm not knocking T. Higgins in any kind of way just because he has Jamar Chase on his team. Like, T. Higgins is still very capable and is still very good. And if something were to ever happen to Jamar Chase, even if he just misses a couple weeks, that's the stuff I can't predict and I don't want to predict. T. Higgins, that just gives him a couple weeks to potentially be a monster. And then now his full season line and everything looks a lot better. And if that comes in the fantasy playoffs or whatever, that wins you your league. I mean, he has that in his bag. And so, like, I just want to analyze T. Higgins. And like you were saying, so I'm looking at him and I'm going, okay, yeah, he does have Jamar Chase on his team, which isn't great for maybe like pure target volume upside for him, right? On the T. Higgins analysis. But it also pulls away probably some some coverage elements and things where I would expect better efficiency because of that.
I've been doing this as long as we've had a show, Tom.
I would expect better efficiency because Chase is on the field with him. Yeah. And I would expect that if Chase were to miss, I mean, like on some teams, I'm going to draft Jamar Chase. On other teams, I'm going to draft T. Higgins. but I want both is basically what it comes down to.
Right.
So like, it's not a zero-sum thing. I can build a portfolio where I have exposure to both. I don't probably want to pay really high prices for both on the same roster necessarily. I mean, it depends. Obviously, you can build a nice stack doing it that way as well. But to your point about the Ravens, I think you're completely right. I think you can play Rashad Bateman at his price because you think certain things about what his profile could mean for year 2, and you can still play Marquise Brown because it could. Part of what you're playing is this probability that Rashad Bateman doesn't live up to that, and now Marquise Brown is crushing.
I think what undergirds a lot of that is just like whatever format you play. I mean, you see the underdog logo on our thing, and you do a lot of tournament stuff with ship chasing, but like even in a dynasty league, like you just benefit a lot more from being right than you're hurt from being wrong. Like even in the context of a dynasty league, 1 out of 12 win, maybe 2 out of 12 or 3 out of 12 pay. And the beauty is every year, like there is some sort of built-in reward if you don't trade your picks for sucking, which is that you get better players next year in the draft. And like you're incentivized to maximize toward to optimize towards higher percentile outcomes, right? Like winning 1 out of 12 is a 92nd percentile outcome. And I understand it's not that simple because you're winning individual games along the way. But like if you are bad, like being 4th is the same as being 10th. And then if you are 10th, like you also get a higher pick next year. So I think there's just inherent value to expanding the range of your outcomes. And I think like I did a thread recently where I talked about like people sort of, I think, have perceptions of like, oh, like this idea of like people always say asymmetrical upside. They say, oh, this player like has upside that's asymmetrical to their downside. And I think that might be true in some cases. I think in a lot of cases, what it really just means is that it's just wider ranges. And like if we're targeting a player like a Bateman, who's younger, a lot of the younger players you talked about, ETN last year, Breece Hall this year, versus like if you're deciding a Breece Hall versus a David Montgomery, like these guys have inherently wider ranges on all sides. And I think where the asymmetrical upside comes into play is not that like their range necessarily is asymmetrically positive, but that we play a game environment that rewards wider ranges of outcomes. And so like monetarily, our like expected value in our wallet becomes asymmetrically positive.
I think that makes perfect sense. The only thing I would tack onto it is it just like, I think people, I don't know, maybe not around here, you guys are a dynasty show, but people miss that value is everything. Right. And so I think it's really hard to think through what you just said, to think through what the actual range is. You can say like it's inherently wider. I was talking about small miss, big hit, right? So there's certainly guys that, and you're talking about the asymmetric. That's what we're looking for, the asymmetric type bet. But there's definitely guys that have big hit, big miss potential, and then there's guys that are really narrow bands, right? And I wouldn't say that I never like target guys that are narrow bands. It becomes a question of price, but you're right. The payoff matters. I certainly would not target a lot of guys that have narrow bands or don't have big upside on the same roster. I mean, in an independent draft, I might take a dude because he's like, in my mind, slipped or whatever, is going below where I think sort of his narrow band, the majority of his narrow band is. But I'm not doing that multiple times, because like he's not going to win me my league ultimately. Like you're right, like fantasy football is decided by league winners. Like it's decided by ceiling. It's decided by independent players. Jamar Chase won leagues last year. Joe Burrow won leagues last year. Like if you want to win, you got to have certain dudes. You got to know what profiles you're looking for, and you got to be able to hit on those guys in certain leagues. There's way too many people that play fantasy football that think it's about stacking a bunch of small like ADP wins. Like, oh yeah, this guy was better than his ADP by a small amount. And so that was a positive pick. It may have been a negative pick, even though he was slightly better than his ADP spot or whatever, because of the alternative. And the alternative was you were passing up one more shot at ceiling. I mean, it's kind of like the NFL draft, like where we've learned over the years, more picks is how you hit on good players. I mean, it's sort of similar, like the asymmetric upside, or there's more upside in this concept of, actually hitting on something than on your misses. That everyone's going to have some misses in the NFL draft, but the only way to like increase your hits over long periods of time, there's basically no teams that are better evaluators than any other teams. It's just to have more picks. It's like, I mean, there's some teams that are terrible at it, but there's not a lot of teams that are just like consistently better at like having a smaller amount of picks and hitting on all of them. And fantasy football is somewhat similar. It's not like I feel like I have more answers than anyone else. I do think there are types of players you target. There's types of strategies you take to increase the possibility that you're hitting on the right guys. But broadly, like you want to take as many opportunities as you can to hit the ceiling that you were just talking about. That like that's going to have the difference in your season. Again, I mean, I think people think their whole team has to be good picks, and like you said, the misses don't matter either. I mean, they really don't. I mean, especially in any league where you have waivers or anything, but even some in best ball, probably not in the biggest best ball tournaments where you kind of just have to be perfect. But you play any season, you go look back at your draft and you look at the end of the year, and you're going to have a bunch of dudes that were zeros on in your draft. I mean, two-thirds of your league, maybe. I mean, if you get 1/3 of your draft right, you're in great shape. Like if you get 1/3 of it right, that is a core, you're going to be able to build on that if you're managing waivers and everything. So the misses aren't that big of a deal. I mean, I'm always targeting upside to your point, because I want as many shots at hitting those 6 or 8 players that could be like the key to my team, as opposed to trying to stack a bunch of little gains when those guys don't have real ceilings.
So you had mentioned talking about players that are on the same team that are kind of in that same thought process. I want to get your opinion on 2 players that are kind of hot button topics on the Bird app and throughout leagues that had somewhat disappointing rookie seasons, that are both looking at increased volume and opportunity, and are both at low costs with big hits. And I want to ask you about your approach to Rondale Moore and Rashad Bateman. When you're sitting there looking through a draft and your process, how do you differentiate 2 players seemingly in the same situation? Because I put those 2 players in very similar situations, even though they're very different players. How do you take your pick when you're at that spot, 7th, 8th round, whatever in your draft? How are you taking your method and applying it to 2 similar players?
It's a great question. I think you're absolutely right that they are similar, and why you're viewing them as similar. Second-year players, we want to be targeting this class of wide receiver. They both had sort of disappointing rookie years, but really strong prospect profiles. There's a lot of similarities, but the way that I would apply that, like, and this is something that, like, you know, like when I write ceiling signals every week, it's very in depth. Like, I think there's people that are always sort of looking for sort of quick answers, or, you know, one metric that's going to solve everything in football. The answer to all of these things to me is like every player is his own little delicate flower, and there's a lot of layers. Like you have to kind of peel it back. More for me.
Are you Nick Sirianni right now?
More for me is a small miss, big hit player, because the small miss part of it is he had a 24%
Is it because he's small?
Outrun. Yeah.
He's getting
small
literal
miss.
now.
Small especially miss is every one of Kyler's incomplete passes.
Yeah, especially where he's going. He's a guy who had a really great targets per out run last year, had a great prospect profile coming in, which we need to extend our analysis to and keep in mind. Like this guy draws volume, and he did early, didn't have any air yards, and wasn't very good because of that. But I don't think he's going to suddenly, especially with Kirk not in the offense anymore, and they were both so heavily in the slot, like now that opens up all these snaps and routes. I don't think he has a lot of scenarios in his range where he's not utilized. I mean, he's their obvious next answer to that vacated spot. The reason, so it's a small hit in the sense that I think he also will draw volume, even if that is like the manufactured touches. They showed us they wanted to do some of that. Mm-hmm. Now, it wouldn't be a big, it would be at least still maybe a potentially small miss if we don't get some air yards and some downfield stuff working with that, right? So there's an issue there where he could be a relatively high volume player, but not really average much in terms of, you know, yards per reception, yards per target, whatever you want to say, and touchdowns and everything, because he's doing too much around the line of scrimmage. The big hit element is just, you know, going to what happened with Deebo Samuel. You're talking about him going into last year. We were sort of viewing him like Rondale, like he's being used like a running back, but then he started to get some downfield work. And if Moore gets that opportunity, and there's, you know, people have strong opinions one way or another on whether that's going to happen, whether he can do that. He had very low ADOTs in college. I wouldn't say that I have a strong opinion. I definitely think he's capable. But more importantly, like, I don't want to try to predict that as much as just trying to predict sort of the various ranges and what would happen. And if he gets the downfield stuff, he's already going to get enough around the line of scrimmage. He showed that as a rookie. that suddenly his profile is really, really strong. And so like he's a guy I definitely want to target, especially in that offense. That's the other element. Bateman's offense, I don't pay a ton of attention to offenses, but Baltimore is one that scares me. And it's one of the only ones last year that I was like, yeah, the overall pass volume, I kind of feel like I'm capping. And the hilarious part of that is I was completely wrong on that. That was like the one that I was like, team volume, I feel like I got a feel on this. They can't go over this amount in their pass attempts, and they blew past it. Absolutely destroyed it. They went over 600 passes. They hadn't even gotten close to 500 passes. I mean, it was 16 games, but still hadn't even gotten close to 500 passes with Lamar at QB. Blew past 600. Some of that was Lamar missed some time. They threw a little bit more in those games. But some of it was running back injuries. But some of it was them passing more with Lamar and those elements. That might stick. I'm concerned. I think that's going to regress and come back. And so I do think that narrows the band a little bit for Bateman. The other element is he didn't have this like 24% targets per out run as a rookie. He didn't have this like clear role. He's running downfield routes. He earned decent volume for a rookie, and I still love the profile. But I think has more of a big miss element to him because there's this potential that the targets per out run don't really increase. The pass volume comes down in that offense. There's enough competition, et cetera, right? And so to me, like there's nothing really baked in to his whole profile where I'm like, I'm sure that he's got a strong floor. Now he's still a guy I want to be.
He's also just more costly, right? Like people,
yeah.
And for the record, I'm fully included in this, that like people want to believe good things about Rashad Bateman. Like I think he was like both Rondale Moore and Bateman from like a numerical perspective were both really good prospects. I think Bateman was a better one just because it wasn't so concentrated in the freshman year. But like Bateman was just a more conventional prospect. Like he's normal sized. He played all 3 years. He had like a more standard college ADOT. Like I think people are inclined to make excuses for Bateman. And I think that that's fair. Like you said, I think we should extend out our view to the college, right? Like if Amon-Ra St. Brown had the season that Rashad Bateman had, I don't think that we should be excited about that. But like Bateman had it, and we had all these good things that we thought about Bateman. I think we should care about those. But you're right. Like there's a chance that he just, that he isn't who we thought he was. Like that's possible.
Yeah. And I completely agree with that. I'm still high on Bateman for everything you just said. It's just like the ways that he could fail are also more conventional, right? Like he's just isn't good at the NFL level at earning volume. Whereas like, I guess all I'm really saying is Rondale feels like he has guaranteed volume kind of baked in this sort of running back role. That's just like as a direct comparison. I just see their ranges slightly different. And then I am a little bit concerned about Bateman's ceiling, and that ties into some of the offense stuff. But again, like this one of the very rare situations where I would pull in offensive stuff. But like Lamar's going to be there. He's going to be their quarterback. And part of the reason they don't have huge pass attempts is he scrambles at a really high rate. He holds the ball. He takes some sacks at a decent rate. I mean, that's the way he plays. And he's a good quarterback playing that way. That's the way that they should functionally play. I still think he has a ton of upside, right? But like I don't know that in that offense I can see a lot of Rashad Bateman top 5 overall seasons. I don't think I can for more either necessarily, but theoretically maybe it's more likely. I don't know. It's just one of those things where it's hard for me to see Bateman be this absolute league winner. But some of it is just uncertainty, right? Like some of it is like you just bet on the year 2 good profile, and I'm definitely not going through this offseason not having, taken a lot of Bateman in redraft.
Well, you draft a lot with Pat, so.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Billy, I'll pitch this one to you first because there's one other rookie receiver that has been much of the talk of the timeline today. I'm pretty clearly in the pro camp, but you've been in the pro camp for longer than anyone that I know. So Amon-Ra St. Brown, the sun god, who had like a really inauspicious start to his rookie year, comes on massively at the end. And now we're having this kind of the same argument that we had about Brandon Ayuk last year in the sense of like, does he earn it? And I think it's interesting too, coming off the conversation we just had about Kenny Golladay, right? Where it's like, hey, he's the only guy. And then so often when someone's supposed to be the only guy and they fail, but yet when someone's the only guy and they like crush worlds, then we still kind of become skeptical. Billy, what's your status? What's the state of the union on Amon-Ra right now? Like, is it strong?
Yeah, it's really funny because there's a lot of time on like fantasy Twitter where it's like the entirety of Twitter just assumes an opinion that the masses have. and then everyone tries to correct that opinion. So it seems like with Amon-Ra St. Brown, a lot of people immediately assumed that people were going to assume that DJ Chark was going to take a lot away. And I think a good amount of people still have that opinion. DJ Chark does have a 100-target season under his resume. But, I mean, there's so much open in Detroit. Like, this feels a lot more like they're just trying to accrue weapons. And it's that thing we were talking about that every team right now is trying to do. It's an arms race in the NFL. We see it with the AFC West. Every team in that division has like 6 wide receiver ones. Like it's just trying to build up these massive teams. And my biggest fear with Amon-Ra St. Brown was that the Lions were going to draft a first-round wide receiver, which I still think is in the range of possibilities, but much less 32. Likely now. Yeah. Like I saw them going out and getting Olave if he was still there at 32. I don't think he's still going to be there, but maybe some other maybe some other wide receivers in the back of the first. But if this is their solution, which I think is a very legitimate shot because they also brought Khalif Raymond back. I think he was on that team last year. And Josh Reynolds. Like they accrued a lot of money to the wide receiver position. They committed 3 separate $10 million contracts over the next 2 years to that position. And that's cheap nowadays. Christian Kirk is making that in 1 season. But like that is the situation we're in, is that these teams are trying to generate an arms race. And it's kind of coming down to, are we worried that DJ Chark is as good as the other options that could have been there in Detroit? And I don't think he is. Like I've been on the DJ Chark train forever. And Jacob, I don't appreciate you trying to capitalize on the fact that I was on that train in our leagues today.
Some offers today.
Yeah. But as soon as that trade happened, I was getting offers from Jacob. But like, I think there are so many worse opportunities that could have happened to Amon-Ra St. Brown that like DJ Chark is one of the least of my worries if he is going in as their wide receiver too.
Ben, what do you make of Amon-Ra? He, especially in Dynasty, like he kind of exists. I think he's I can't remember the last time, first of all, that a second-year wide receiver was more expensive in best ball and redraft than he was in Dynasty. Like his best ball ADP right now is wide receiver 23. His Dynasty ADP is wide receiver 27, which is like a really weird thing to say about a 22-year-old wide receiver. What do you make of him like in Dynasty right now? He's kind of in this weird zone. He's clearly behind Smith and Moore and like obviously Waddle and Chase. A bit ahead of like the Bateman, Tony, and then Rondale. Like, are you buying into him? And Tom, you put your hand up, so feel free to butt in too.
Yeah, I was just saying, I'm looking at DLF right now for Amon-Ra, and it's 24. So I don't know if he went down on what you were looking at.
Is that single QB?
It's just his positional ADP.
No, there's like a weird thing. It doesn't matter, but like his super flex Dynasty ADP among wide receivers is lower than his single QB, which doesn't make any sense. But anyway, mid-20s. He's going to the mid-20s. Yeah.
Oh my god.
Well, I mean, first of all, how hilarious is it that DJ Chark got 1 year, $10 million when we talk about what the Jags gave Christian Kirk to let DJ Chark walk?
They gave Zay Jones. I mean, they gave Zay Jones that, but more.
Right. So, I mean, Chark signing that deal, I mean, it's like a prove it deal, but
yeah.
I just recorded Stealing Bananas earlier today. It's probably not even out yet, but I was kind of saying on that, like it is also a prove it deal where I can't imagine his camp preferred Detroit because we all sort of understand that as the downfield high ADOT guy, Jared Goff is not even the average quarterback that you would want in that situation. He's certainly below average. He might be one of the very worst quarterbacks to have for a DJ Chark type player, a downfield weapon who's trying to, in 1 year, sort of make himself into the next 20 million a year, 3 or 4 year deal type of wide receiver, which is probably not going to happen because he signed with Detroit now. But
Vegas.
So, but I do think that contract matters in the context of the Lions didn't really commit a whole lot to get him. It's not like they made him a massive priority. It's not like they did what the Jags did with all their contracts. They literally they gave him 1 year and $10 million. I mean, they gave like Khalif Raymond and Josh Reynolds. Like, I don't know. I haven't actually dug into their contracts, but I don't think it's much different.
I mean, but what do you make of Amon-Ra like in a vacuum? Because if he's not better than Chark, then he's like massively overpriced. But like, I think he probably is. Like, what do you make of him? Like, how about this? Like, let's say they do draft George Pickens at pick 34, second pick of the second round. Like, to me, like if Amon-Ra is a buy now, then he has to be someone who we're not scared off because they drafted another good player, right?
I think you're totally right. I think he's overvalued. And I mean, and I actually was going to say, it's a weird setup that you're talking about where he's going higher in redraft than in Dynasty, but it almost makes sense for this player because I think we can feel like the situation from last year is similar enough that in 2022, I feel pretty confident in what he's going to be able to do. They're not going to be able to get enough target competition in there to really damage the massive targets per out run he had last year as a rookie. I mean, he looked great in all those metrics, but long term, I mean, look, he's a lower ADOT guy, and if he ever does play with enough target competition that it brings that targets per out run down, now you're starting to talk about. I mean, that's a wide receiver profile that, like, to be elite, you have to be Keenan Allen. You got to be 27, 28% targets per out run. Amon-Ra started at 24 as a rookie. You can always go forward in year two. He could be that guy. You know, you got to be Deontay Johnson, 27, 28, 30% sometimes. Amon-Ra could be that guy. I can't write that off when he had 24% as a rookie. At the same time, he didn't have any target competition. And if you're not any more than 24%, if you're 22% or whatever, and you don't have a whole lot of air yards and you're, you know, then your career's like later career Jarvis Landry, not earlier career Jarvis Landry, which isn't bad, but I don't want to be paying the, you know, extreme price right now to acquire Amon-Ra. I mean, I think I don't know that I'd necessarily be selling him. Depends where you're sitting. I think he'll be good in 2022, but it's not like, I don't think it should be that his price in Dynasty is lower than his price in redraft, but I don't think that is like a weird setup for him specifically, if that makes sense. I mean, I am concerned if they bring in Pickens. I'm concerned. Okay,
see, that's so I'm different. I'm honestly not like I'm buying Amon-Ra at like mid wide receiver or late wide receiver 2 prices in Dynasty.
There you go, Jacob. Tom Lee just asked you.
Yeah, I'm taking. I would trade my 111, which it's interesting that we're talking about Pickens because like Pickens is currently ranked as my 11th player right now in this class. So like they could literally be on the same team. Like I would rather have Amon-Ra in the 111. I think what's interesting is people have made this Ayuk comparison a lot, and like I get it. I can't really like push back on that because I was big into Ayuk. Not big into him when he went like wide receiver 10 in Dynasty. That was insane. But the issue is like Brandon Ayuk, who is sort of the guy last year who was a rookie, weirdly, like I think a worse profile in my opinion as a prospect than Amon-Ra, but obviously went round 1, so that really evens out a lot of it. He comes in, you know, has this massive stretch with other guys getting hurt. And the argument was like, look, he has this excellent PFF grade. His reception perception is elite. Like it looks like he's a really good NFL player. He produced a lot for fantasy. He earned targets. Like this guy's just a one. It doesn't matter. And it didn't really shake out that way. Interestingly to me though, like Ayuk and Amon-Ra are like back-to-back in ADP right now. So to me, like if the downside risk of Amon-Ra is Ayuk, like he's kind of already priced at his downside risk. And I get that he was a 4th round pick, but like looking into PFF grades and how we can apply those, like his PFF grade was 80. He was higher than everyone in this rookie class outside of Jamar Chase. His targets per route run was, as you said, like up at 24. That's fantastic. He was earning targets at a really high rate. He was efficient on those targets. He was by all means, or at least efficient relative to the Goff experience. And then, you know, you look at where he's at in PFF, we'll see. I'm interested to see where a lot of his reception perception stuff comes and what he's doing versus man beyond what he's doing as a zone beater. But like, I think this guy can play. Like if you look at the guys who have been at that threshold from a PFF perspective, round 3, round 4 picks, even it's like McLaurin, it's Diggs, it's Tyreek Hill, it's Keenan Allen, like it's Doug Baldwin, who is like obviously undrafted on a limited number of routes. It's AB. Like there's no misses. Like the only potential miss is Ayuk, who has a long way to go and may turn into a superstar for all we know. Like
the Ayuk comp is terrible. I mean, it's just pattern matching and it's it happens every year in fantasy football. Just the most similar situation last year, we're gonna overvalue it for this year. I mean, and what do we have? We have a sample size of 1. I mean, we don't know why Ayuk failed. Part of why Ayuk failed is off the field stuff. They weren't even playing him.
Part of it's Debo's possibly the best football player in the world.
Right. There's just so many elements in it. Again, you go back to the delicate little flower of every player. Ayuk's situation does not mean anything for Amon-Ra St. Brown, in my opinion. You want to look at broad analysis, several different players that were going into year 2 or going into year 3, and young players that had similar profiles and were valued this way, then maybe I'll look at that. But I'm not going to apply just the Brandon Ayuk. It just becomes pretty lazy. And they're not even similar players, frankly. Amon-Ra is a quick twitch, low ADOT guy. Ayuk was the argument for Ayuk over Debo last year was he's the guy that gets the air yards. He's the more vertical receiver. Incidentally, why I'm not really worried about Chark for Amon-Ra is they operate at different depths. It's not even a thing in my mind. But yeah, I mean, I'm with you. I mean, you kind of sold me on that. What I would counter with, and my question would be, is what is Amon-Ra's ceiling? Because he can be a good buy, but it's maybe it's a narrow band. You're kind of making me feel like it's not a big miss opportunity at his price, but I don't know that he's a big hit guy.
Okay.
I mean, I think the ceiling is Keenan, realistically, or Woods maybe. Woods is not the highest ceiling. Woods is maybe a Woods career is maybe a 75th percentile outcome. I think I could see a Deontay or a Keenan beyond that. And I think it's possible. In
Dynasty, he's probably not priced there yet because he's so young and you get multiple years of that. In redraft, he's already kind of priced close to that.
To be clear, I'm buying him in Dynasty. I've drafted none in redraft. I've drafted none. I like Michael Thomas more in that range. I like Devontae Smith more. But Devontae Smith's an interesting one because he's one where in Dynasty, Smith is going well ahead of Brown, 2-3 rounds ahead. And then St. Brown is going actually ahead of him, an underdog. And, Smith is one where he's one that's really weighed down by a situation because there's fear they might add another wide receiver. They don't pass a whole lot. I love Smith, especially at his redraft price in Dynasty as well. But he's a guy that he looked like a smash last year. He was supposed to be a smash. He was the 10th overall pick. He lit it up in college. He earned targets at a pretty high rate, and he did it down the field. He had a ridiculous ADOT last year of 14. I think that's would be bad if that continues, but I don't think it will continue because I don't think that he's that limited of a player. And I think that's a guy what if they pass a lot more? They wanted to last year. They wanted to pass a lot more last year. They adapted their offense halfway through, but now that's different. Billy, you had a game.
Yeah, this is just a quick one, and it specifically ties into the question of what his ceiling is.
Oh boy, I can't wait.
Yeah, this is a fun one. So this is just a real simple question. How many players in PPR scoring do you think outscored Amon-Ra St. Brown from week 12 to week 18 last year?
1, Cooper Kupp.
It's 3. Yeah, it's not a lot. Is it 1?
It's so that at the wide receiver position, Jacob is right.
Oh, okay.
So it's Cooper Kupp. I want to make sure I get it right. Cooper Kupp, Josh Allen, and Justin Herbert were the only people to outscore.
I was going to say 3, so I'm counting that as a
victory.
Yeah, even though I didn't understand that quarterbacks were included.
You nailed it.
That is such an insane run over any stretch. And the fact that Cooper Kupp is the only wide receiver to supersede him in that stretch, Amon-Ra St. Brown's ceiling at that target share is astronomical.
Yeah, but we can't.
But that's not real.
But yes, that's not real.
What was his target share? Was it 35% or something insane?
I have no idea what it was.
Thing that I just said we can't do with the pattern matching, but that's the Tyler Higbee argument. He had the 5-game stretch a couple years ago, and everyone has talked about that for 3 years, and that's the only time the dude's ever earned targets. And I'm way more impressed that Amon-Ra's full season numbers were still very strong, right?
Yes,
I was saying 24%. Yeah. I just looked at my database. I have it at 22%. Which is not a trivial difference. I had it in my mind that he was all the way up at 24. 22 is still very good for the year. And it is notable in the fact that he's a rookie, and we expect rookies to be better throughout the year and kind of get a better feel for what they really are late in their rookie year. It is one of the only groups that I will actually use splits for, so I'm not necessarily throwing that out the window. But it's tough in a small sample.
Oh, yeah.
Here's the best case I could make for Amon-Ra, beyond that split. is like, and Tom's killing me because we're already in an hour. Like, okay, Amon-Ra St. Brown to me, like, and I understand that the NFL like it does a very good job of telling us when our spreadsheet lies to us for the most part. But like Amon-Ra St. Brown was like not a bad prospect. Like he was a good prospect. He was a 3-year early declare. He broke out in his freshman year. He competed with Michael Pittman, who's I think overrated, but is a good NFL wide receiver. Competed with Drake London, who might be a top 10 pick. He was a freshman, but still he's on that team. And then Tyler Vaughn, who like was a really good collegiate receiver. He looked to me like I expected him to go in round 3 of the NFL draft. I think if he had tested better, he probably does. It wouldn't have shocked me if he went in round 2. Like to me, if the NFL told me like, no, this guy's dynamic, he's good, he's a really good NFL player, I would have grouped him in with those guys going in early round 2 last year, if that's where he went. Of course, he goes to round 4, and we should have adjusted our priors at the time. We probably still should now. But like that's really the only missing piece to me. Like he always produced in college. He's now produced in the NFL. I think if you want to make the argument that you did that his ceiling's a little limited, it's that he was kind of a flat producer in college, which is like kind of like a David Bell this year, where he was a guy that produced early, which we love, and then he didn't really like elevate beyond that much. And maybe we see something similar in the NFL. Like maybe he's just tapped out.
We know why. He's not an air yards guy. Like he's not a downfield profile. He's not an operates at all depths kind of guy. And that like, so a lot of people love yards per run. I love to break it up into targets per run and yards per target. Yards per target, obviously not a sticky stat or anything like that. But the low ADOT guys can't hit on these like massive yards per target type seasons. That's part of the benefit of having this downfield profile, or even a profile that operates at all depths, is you can have the massive downfield efficiency that can lead to big yardage numbers, even when you're probably not earning targets at a massive rate. Amon-Ra doesn't have that in his profile. And so that's the other, you said like the one missing piece was the draft capital. I'd say the other missing piece is air yards. Like there is a cap ceiling. You started earlier in the show talking about how we're looking at ceiling and all these picks. I mean, I think you got to know what you're getting with Amon-Ra, in the sense that like, I don't want a ton of guys like that at too high of a price, because part of it is what else? Like, what could you get at the 111? What else could you do with that 111? You could be targeting someone that makes a bigger impact on your roster. I don't know that Amon-Ra is capable of being the massive hit.
Yeah, he's a player to me that's being like bought and projected at that stretch and ignoring kind of everything else. I don't think there's a way they get out of bringing somebody else in. I just don't think that that's what they want to do. We're gonna cut to a break. When we come back, we're gonna pay some bills with Underdog, and then we're gonna get into the next portion here, a little bit more about strategy and different ways to approach the game, and it's gonna be a great time. Here's another clip from our show with Pat Doherty. At what point do you think you'd be willing to move the guys like Tyreek Hill and the Cooper Kupps and Devontae Adams for the Elijah Moores and the, darling young wide receivers? What does that take for you in your gap, just personally, when you're approaching Dynasty, especially in startups?
You talking to me?
I am.
Tommy. I was still, I'd be leaning on the old guard, because I've learned the hard way in Dynasty, projecting more 2-3 years in the future is just kind of it's just whatever. It doesn't work out a lot. And I'd still just be more comfortable taking even 2 years of Devontae Adams over, say, Elijah Moore's career. Even though I love Elijah Moore, I'd rather just bet on the next 2 years of Devontae Adams than the next 10 years of Elijah Moore, as much as I love Elijah Moore.
Again, terrific show with Pat. A lot of great information. You can go and catch that over at both the Dynasty Vipers YouTube network, the Full Tilt Dynasty Podcast YouTube network, and wherever you find the Full Tilt Dynasty Podcast. Guys, look, Underdog. Obviously, a lot of us here spend a lot of time drafting best ball teams and playing pick'em games, and you can do that with Underdog. And now, if you've never played before and you kind of want to get into it, if you're kind of tired of hearing Jacob talk about best ball ADPs and puppy tournaments and the like, you can go now join him and draft against him over on Underdog. If you use promo code FULLTILT, Underdog's going to double your initial buy-in up to $100. It's a great deal. You don't want to miss it. If you are going to play Underdog Fantasy with us and helps us, helps you, and you can go and beat Jacob and talk as much smack on the Bird app as you need to. Ben, again, your process and all the information that you put out through your pods and your newsletters, all absolutely fantastic. There's one thing that Jacob loves to hammer home in our Slack channel, and it is continuous. It is nonstop, and it is all the time. It's zero RB building.
Oh.
I want to talk about zero RB building because I'm going to be honest. This year I have gone into drafts actively trying to do this for the first time. I've been a draft, one QB and one running back, like first 2 rounds for as long as I can remember playing fantasy. And this year I decided I'm going to switch it up and I'm going to play some zero RB. And part of that is with, what you've brought to the table and what Jacob's brought to the table.
I want to be clear though, too. Like, I think zero RB is really it's an adjustment of thresholds. Like, I think it's an adjustment of what you need in a running back in order to draft them. I don't think it's I go into my draft and say wide receiver, right click.
I mean, when I say in the Slack channel, your quote that I'm currently building for our website is literally just in brackets or in quotes, just draft a receiver. That's when someone asks you a question.
You
more
can
often
quote me on that.
It is. So it is bad. I'm in this Discord with Drew Ozachek, and every day someone messages me what would you look for in return for David Montgomery? And I'm probably a wide receiver.
Yeah.
And they're like, what would you try to get in return for Elijah Mitchell? And I'm like, well, probably a wide receiver. So it is true.
So with that, the phrase zero RB has become somewhere between a lightning rod and a synonym for personality trait. But you've proven it can be successful in large tournaments such as the Scott Fish Bowl tournament. And in your eyes, what are the key tenets to zero RB that go beyond hating running backs, which is what I think the misconception is that people who play zero RB hate all running backs and just never want to roster any of them. Or is it too much risk to limit the chance of running? Oh, I'm sorry. I last part of the paragraph. I screwed that up. Hating on running backs, and how can you apply that to Dynasty?
Yeah, I mean, zero RB is the name elicits so many different reactions, and it's funny.
Usually anger from people.
What I always say when I start talking about it is I get the impression from a lot of people that have heard about it or have a lot of these reactions that they've probably never actually read the original zero RB piece from Sean Siegel, which was written in 2013 now. It's been 9 years. And it's been so mangled over those 9 years and Sean has done, Sean's kind of a quiet dude. He doesn't necessarily boast his takes out there. He's not on Twitter. Obviously I pod with him all the time, but he has kind of let it. I think he kind of gets a kick out of just letting people take it wherever they want to go with it. He's never tried to step in and try to necessarily change that. But over the years, he has reapplied it to different things. I mean, he was using the concept of modified zero RB a year or more before Anchor RB or Hero RB or any of those things came into discussion. And then last year, the whole thing was people would get pissed if you said that it was modified zero RB, because how could it possibly be zero RB if you're taking a running back in the first round? That doesn't make any sense. That's not what I was told zero RB is. If you go back and read what he writes about, I mean, you talk about how I write about anti-fragility. That's where that concept came from. It's called zero RB, anti-fragility, and the myth of value-based drafting. He uses a quote from Taleb, his book, Anti-Fragility, in the piece. What he is discussing is this concept, which was novel in 2013, maybe not so novel to people now, that running backs are the position, the only position, and this is inarguable, where you have a teammate that gets injured and suddenly a 15th round guy suddenly is being valued in the 3rd round. We saw it last year with Darrell Henderson. Cam Akers tore his Achilles. Darrell Henderson was a 12th, 13th rounder. Then he was a 5th rounder in redraft, or even higher. I think he got it to the 3rd round, a week later. Literally. I mean, that doesn't happen at wide receiver because there's other players on the team. Everyone kind of inches up a little bit or doesn't. Sometimes they don't even move because it's sort of dependent on what that will mean for the passing game. That doesn't happen at quarterback. That doesn't happen at tight end. You don't suddenly have a guy jump 12 rounds in value just because of like a teammate injury or one very random point. And so this concept of anti-fragility, when you're building your entire roster, the whole idea of anti-fragility, the way Taleb defines it, is things that thrive in chaos. We're talking about this timeline, and it's going to branch. Things are going to happen. We want things that actually get better, not just are robust or resilient. And this is where the whole concept of robust running back came. Those discussions started in 2013. Like there was all these arguments back then. Sean's piece before he wrote about anti-fragility was, I think, writing about the concept of robust RB. And his point was like, you want to be robust to these shocks to your team, these injuries, these busts, these hit. We know that running backs bust at a high rate. And receivers just score more points at most spots in drafts, in PPR especially, right? And so, I mean, this is sort of all, redraft focused, but the idea is you have a team that is 0 RB. Not only are you not taking on a lot of bust risk early, but because you didn't draft a lot of running backs early, you're taking a lot of those types of Darrell Henderson players I was just describing. Like, I think this is one of the things that gets missed as well, is like when you take 3 or 4 running backs early, you might only take 1 or 2 in the 10th to 14th round. When you don't take any early, you take 6. You take a bunch of these stabs to try to hit Leonard Fournette from last year, Cordero Patterson, whoever it is. You might get them off waivers, you might not, whatever. But also running back's a position where it's really hard to look at full season scoring because we know like who's going to be good in fits and spurts. We knew when D'Ernest Johnson was going to be the starter for the couple weeks he was a starter, and we had him in lineups, right? Like, So people love to look at full season stats and make arguments about 0 RB. The receivers that push up and make receiver look flatter are not in lineups the weeks that they have these spike weeks. The running backs that have that, like Alexander Madison, those dudes, like they were started in those weeks. They were the DFS chalk those weeks. Those were the guys that so it's this idea that running back is a position that when the opportunity presents itself, we know it's there. We can put these dudes in our lineup and we can score a bunch of points off it. And so building a lineup that way, stacking the receivers early, which is where you're going to get the full season upside at receiver almost exclusively, stacking running backs later where you can potentially hit these big booms, you have this massive ceiling. And as the season plays out, your roster is improving while others are, they're losing players. They're losing running backs. Obviously, receivers can get hurt too, but you've built in a lot of robustness that, it could be called robust receiver if you want to call it that. You've built in a lot of robustness at receiver. But yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting discussion.
Tom, if you don't hear that phrase, maybe you read my articles.
Yeah, I think Tom Lee, you just told on yourself, buddy.
I'm in your Slack channel, bro. I'm in like 6 of your leagues.
The final thing I want to say on that, though, real quick, is that Sean went to modified 0 RB and all that stuff even earlier than Anchor and all this stuff, because since he wrote that article in 2013, we started to see the way running backs were used shift. They started, it was kind of starting a little bit before that, but we used to have 300 carry backs. We don't have them as much anymore. Started to see those backs, the best backs, catch more passes. You go back to 2005, 2002, 2000, the leading running backs in fantasy didn't catch 60 passes like they do now. Or maybe there was 1 or 2, but there wasn't 5 or 6 like there can be in the season now. And so it changed things to where we had this, Uber back. And so then you could still apply these same kind of tenets and the same ideology, but not have to pass up Christian McCaffrey at 101 just because you're a 0 RB zealot. Like, no one has ever said to do that.
I want to talk about what I said earlier with thresholding, and I'm going to try and make like a slight poker analogy. But basically, like, if you think about like a poker hand, right? Like there's very little like difference ultimately between like your 9 to like your 2 in the sense of without knowing anything else, right? Like it's at a certain point, like how high the card is matters a lot less to just like, okay, maybe I get a pair out of it. Maybe I get a 3 of a kind out of it. And like, to me, that's kind of where we're at with a lot of running backs. Like there's this threshold roll, and we'll be tracking it because I'm going to be running this series on Player Profiler every week called the Running Back Streaming Project, where we'll just like look at the anatomy of essentially what I call like the RB2 role, who's likely to fill it, and like, can we effectively stream it? Like you stream quarterback and tight end. And from what I tracked last year, you often can. And there's like this baseline role. And for anyone who plays DFS, like it's just kind of like what you expect from a $5,800 running back, which is like 15 carries and like 4 targets And anyone who plays cash games DFS would remember, or could remember, like when the Giants played the Raiders last year, and Devontae Booker was the starter for the Giants, and Jacobs was the starter for the Raiders. They were like the same price and like the same projection. Like if you go into any projection source, like, and you play DFS, the projection source has no idea when you drafted Josh Jacobs, and it thinks that he's the exact same as Devontae Booker. Like, it does not see any difference between them. And I'm not saying that to like take a shot at Josh Jacobs, but like most of these running backs, like a Jacobs, like their utility to an NFL team is their reliability, whatever they're able to provide on an NFL football field that like gets them inserted into a role. But that role is ultimately all we're drafting. And like Ben says, like running backs get hurt. There's just way less of a correlation between talent and fantasy value at running back than there is at wide receiver, because carries, like playing time, is earned so much to the extent that the coach plays you on any given day, but they're not earned in the sense that targets are earned from a wide receiver where you're out there competing with multiple people and earning them. I think like that's why I'm constantly talking about pass catching. That's why I'm like getting flamed on Twitter about Kenneth Walker takes, because it's like, how is this guy going to score 20 points? He has like a 2.7% receiving market share. Like, how is this guy going to be a CMC guy and not a guy that I'm not wanting to draft in round 4? Like, I really do think it's a thresholding, because yes, if a running back is able to give you that type of ceiling, like, yeah, you can't compete with that, because the point that people make about running back scarcity is true. There are more wide receivers you can get that are solid, that are quote unquote wide receiver 2s, maybe even more so as teams expand and target that position thoroughly. But I do think like otherwise, if you're drafting some of these guys in redraft, like in round 4, round 5, these dead zone backs, like if you're drafting to me a Jacobs or a Montgomery or a Mitchell or a lot of these guys in Dynasty, I think more so than anything, you're just paying to know who your RB2 is every week. And specifically in Dynasty, it still matters.
People need that though. Like, I feel like people who are drafting like really need that safety. I need a
but I
for
think
sure
that they should
thing.
be more comfortable with being uncomfortable. Like, I guess that's my
I've
thing.
talked
like,
about that a ton before. Yeah,
like,
yeah.
you should be
like
more comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yeah,
like a
being
lot of
willing to be uncomfortable is super huge. The point you were just making about the RB2 thing, like you can lock that in. That's great. And this is not necessarily as applicable to Dynasty. So I do get that, especially deep Dynasty leagues.
Right.
But in redraft, especially, what people also miss whenever they try to do these big analyses on zero RB and everything is, I don't have to pick my RB2 at the beginning of the year and play him in my RB2 slot the whole year. Or if I did, let's say it's easier to have this discussion thinking about like modified zero RB. Like I took a first round back and I actually have that spot locked up. But I don't take a second back until the 12th or 13th round.
Right.
The reality is I can piece together, like you were saying, the streaming concept. I think it's going to be a great article. It's a great idea. This idea that I can play a different running back at RB2 basically every week. And people think that's harder than it is. I know everybody's trying to go. It's not easy, but it's not hard. Like employing zero RB effectively is not easy, but I don't think it's as hard as people think. I know everyone's going to go try and pick up all of the running backs every single week. But if you know what you're looking for, you know what you're doing, you should have some players in those late rounds that you can at least, a couple guys that you can at least plug in most weeks and get you like even just like 6 to 8 points. And I know people think that's like a bust week. I'm fine with that at my RB2 spot in a lot of weeks.
How often do you lose your week by 6 points?
Right, you don't. And you don't. It's exactly right. And I have enough firepower at receiver and often an earlier quarterback or tight end. I have enough other firepower to make up for that. Points are points. People think running back points count more. They don't.
Here's a tweet. Like Nick Chubb had 15.2 points per game last year. David Montgomery 15. Josh Jacobs 14.9. Devontae Booker from weeks 5 to 9, which is a stretch that he was the starting running back, 15.8. Darrell Williams weeks 6 to 10, his stretch 17.8. Deontay Foreman weeks 14 through 17, 14.1. Cordero Patterson and Mitchell had 14.5 and 15 for the entire year.
Devontae Booker had a stretch, or not Devontae Booker, Devonta Freeman, who like I thought was dust, had a stretch of like 12 or 13 or 14 points for quite a while. But it's not even these multi-week stretches that I would say. It's the spot starts too that you can, like when I'm talking about my RB2 slot, I get to factor in that I got a 25-point week out of D'Ernest Johnson that 1 week. I get to factor in that I had Alexander Madison on my bench in the 12th round, and I played him those 2 weeks. That gave me 25 points out of my RB2 slot. So my RB2 slot is not a guy, but I got ceiling weeks out of that spot. Those individual weeks. Justin Jackson was the dude late in the year I was saying was available everywhere.
I won Billy's league with Justin Jackson. I took DeAndre Swift. It was a dynasty league. I took DeAndre Swift in round 2. I didn't take a single other running back until round 13. who ironically did nothing for me. It was like Kylan Hill, we drafted in February, and Justin Jackson, off the waiver wire.
Yeah, I mean, there was a point in stealing signals and on stealing bananas. I know in season I was saying he was the single best pickup because of some other research I do on high value touches and other things that I felt that if Austin Eckler left, and based on the way I was kind of tracking their workloads, I thought I was very confident Justin Jackson was going to get that work, particularly the Eckler role, the receiving and everything. He got that opportunity. He has a 30-point game. Again, like I'm not saying it's easy, but it's not that hard when, like, if you were reading my newsletter, I was telling you he's the one guy that's available everywhere. He was available in our 5K buy-in NFC league that we did free. I mean, this is like the best fantasy redraft players in the world. It's an incredibly expensive league to play in. It's a lot of people love to push back and go, everyone's trying to get the hot name on the waiver wire that week.
Get them early.
You do have to rotate your backs all season. You have to okay, now I want to pick up Justin Jackson in case Eckler misses. I feel confident that's going to be a huge spot start for me. That's what happened. And he has a 30-point game. I mean, you get that. Yeah. How many 30-point games did Josh Jacobs have last year? Those other names that you mentioned. They didn't, I don't even know if they had like any. Like
I don't think so. But here's the other thing too. People say like, okay, but what happens, if you can't get that guy? What happens? Like, I don't know. I guess what happens is you lose. I don't know. Like, what happens if like 90% of outcomes happen in your fantasy league? Well, what happens is you lose because you're trying to be 1 out of 12. Like, you probably will lose. I'll say this about Dynasty before I want to get Billy and Tom on this too, because I keep talking. But like it is hard to apply this to Dynasty, and I get that. And people come at this. I mean, the biggest reason why it's hard to apply to Dynasty, of course, is because the waiver wire, and like most Dynasty leagues have 10 bench or 15 bench or 20, and like the league where I basically did like an anchor RB successfully was Billy's, and it was a pretty tight bench league, and it's harder if there's like 20. But what I always say is you still have options. Like the principles still apply. You have to adapt them. One is that, you can just get lucky, right? Like I had leagues where I had Cordarrelle Patterson stashed or Elijah Mitchell, right? And then, okay, you actually just get an RB2 now, like for free. Like now you actually just basically get like whatever that RB2 would have been, and you don't even have to do anything. Like that's just your guy for the year. And you probably won't hit. Maybe you pick like one of these mid-round guys. You take like educated dart throws at these mid-round guys, like a Connor or a Fournette last year. If you had one of them, like, if I'm being honest, I didn't have a lot of them, but if you did, like they crushed for you, right? Like, or even a little lower, like a Melvin Gordon, who is at least serviceable and can get you through weeks until you get that big injury break. And then you can just stash guys. Like you can stash a bunch of these guys, like take shots on Justin Jackson, Deontay Foreman, and etc. And like, maybe you'll hit when you need to. And I think the other thing too is people focus too much on week 1 in Dynasty. Like realistically, like how many times do you lose by 6 points? Not enough that's the reason why you miss the playoffs. Like if you start like a 6-pack of strong wide receivers, like one league that I didn't win, but I finished second in, like I had just a ridiculously good 6-pack of wide receivers. My running backs sucked because I had Akers and Dobbins. My running backs were absolute ass all year. But I was like, you know what? Like, let's just win a bunch of games. And then maybe I'll get lucky. Like my wide receivers can propel me to the playoffs. And maybe by the time playoffs come around, I'll have running backs. And it turned out Deontay Foreman was stashed on my bench. And so I had a running back. And it turned out like, then it's like, oh, great. We're lucky. We have Cordarrelle Patterson and Deontay Foreman. Now we can actually try and win games. And if I wasn't lucky, like then you can make a trade. But I think it's important to give yourself opportunities to get lucky first, because sometimes you do, or sometimes the opposite happens. Sometimes then 3 of your wide receivers get hurt. And then it's like, oh, my team sucks. I actually, if I had any good running backs, I'd want to be selling them right now because my team's horrible anyway. Like I do think that applies too in Dynasty.
Billy, I have a question. So if you have something to add, do you want to go?
No,
Zero RB?
I think everything about zero RB I've hit inside of like the last year.
Okay.
I think it's a fine strategy at this point. I think wide receivers are becoming the opposite of tight ends, where there's so many good ones that you don't have to think about them in the early rounds. Like it's changing so much, but I think zero RB is a completely fine strategy nowadays. I used to hate it, but I'm coming around.
I mean, you took Elijah Moore in the 3rd round of a draft recently. We know
And
that
I'm-
you're
very happy about it.
Coming
I'm
around.
very happy about it.
And part of what Billy is saying, how it's coming around, Ben, do you find it's getting harder and harder in your drafts to really hit maximum ceiling with this draft? Because Jacob complains about it all the time, about like where all my leagues that people want are running backs, right?
Yeah.
You're seeing guys like Kamara and Cook like sometimes fall to that 5th round in a startup, which a couple of years ago was absolutely not a thing. And I know you had an episode in I think it was July of 2021 where you talked about Cook being like an outrageous outlier, and that things are really turning around for zero RB and high wide receiver drafting. Do you find it's getting harder to really maximize that approach now as it becomes more popular, or do you still feel it's?
I mean, certainly when a lot of people are doing the same thing, it becomes more challenging. I would say that it makes me want to stick to those tenets more because it doesn't change the risk profiles of the running backs. It doesn't change anything if the market starts to get more efficient. I still want to maximize the wide receiver upside I can get in those early rounds, which I prioritize more. And I still have an opportunity to take the same types of running backs late. I mean, I think Jacob said it really well a little bit ago where he's talking about, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong if this is sort of what you were saying, but when you were talking about thresholds, like to me, the way I was envisioning that is like, I've written a lot about the running back dead zone. That's become obviously a really popular thing, right? That term, that concept in redraft. The way I look at it is like, there's 10 top running backs at the very top of drafts. They're young enough, they're good enough that I'm willing to draft. And then it's like, after like, that's sort of kind of like the threshold for me where like, after that, you're paying a price. It gets flat. You're paying a price for Josh Jacobs or something in the 4th or 5th round because we go back to this projections thing. We go back to this big hit, little miss thing. Those guys are small hit, big miss guys. They don't have massive ceilings and they have huge floors. Like we know that running backs can bust and just kind of sink you. You're paying that same price just because those guys project a certain way in full season projections. It looks like Josh Jacobs is going to be the workhorse. It looks like he's their lead back. But we see because of injury or just because of performance, sometimes running backs, teams shift the way that they're using their running backs. Maybe it's not like massive shifts, but there are, at least sometimes small shifts. The secondary back becomes more involved, whatever. We just talked about James Conner. James Conner's season started and he was in the role that was sort of kind of the upside role where he would get all these touchdowns. But then he also got the element where Edmonds misses time. And I think the thought was that he wouldn't be a full-time back if that happened, but he was. And then he got the receiving work as well. Suddenly he's a every down back. I mean, he's like getting used incredibly well. A lot of things went positively for him, but the point obviously is that we don't know how the opportunity is going to be allocated at the running back position. We can't project it particularly well. And just because we're projecting it for some guys, they go in like the 5th round, they go in this dead zone, and we're not projecting it for other guys like the Darrell Hendersons or whatever. They're going in the 12th round. Yet their opportunities to hit certain ranges of their probabilities of hitting certain ranges of opportunity are not that different because there's basically only downside to the big projections of the non-elite running backs. And there's basically only upside to the really small projections of a lot of these backups where we don't project them in huge amounts because we squeeze them out in the projection process because we have to give the starter all of his touches. But anything happens, this guy goes up. That's the anti-fragile thing. Anything happens. The guy sucks in front of him. The guy gets hurt in front of him. These backups, their projection increases immediately. And so the actual gap of the probabilities of what they're going to hit way closer. It's a way flatter from like the 4th to 5th round of running back to the 12th to 15th round than any other position, I think. I mean, it's super, super flat. Definitely than wide receiver. Way, way flatter. And so even when you start to look at Dalvin Cook, Alvin Kamara, they're falling into these ranges. It's interesting because they have shown upside that they can be like difference-making backs, 20-plus point per game PPR backs, right? And so I would maybe take a stab on a guy like that at a certain point. Yeah. They might be a part of this 10 running back group that I'm saying could be difference makers. But for the most part, when we start to see the broad shifts and we start to see a lot of people doing zero RB along, with me, I want to be more disciplined. I want to be getting more receiver depth and basically just almost try to outdraft them. I know that it does become challenging. I know that sounds a little bit silly as well. No. But if you don't take those receivers early, what happens is you basically just get boxed out at receiver. If you go, okay, I can get loaded up at running back, great. You're not going to have any receivers and you're not going to get them because you have to. The only way to get the difference making receivers is early. I mean, like Not maybe the only way, obviously. Amon-Ra St. Brown, great example. Like very similar to a handcuff running back where he had this stretch where he was incredibly good and he was a late round pick at receiver. That does happen. It's just far less likely to get elite performances at receiver late because it is so talent dependent, because there are multiple guys, because you have to have this target earning potential. We know who those guys are. I mean, we just have a better idea at wide receiver of who those guys are that can be elite. At running back, I mean, we know some stuff about talent, but it's just so opportunity driven again. So to me, I don't want to get boxed out at receiver is the way that I end up starting to look at it. And I'm like, I'm going to still make sure I get receiver. Yeah, it sucks in the 5th round if I have to start taking a receiver that I would hopefully normally be able to get in the 8th round. But I'm a lot more comfortable taking that dude in the 5th round when he's my wide receiver 5 or my wide receiver 4 than if I had to now consider him as my wide receiver 2 or my wide receiver 1. Like then I feel like I'm just screwed. Like you're not going to win that way. You're not going to win against a bunch of 0 RBers going running back heavy. I mean, you can, but
but one of them is going to get lucky, right? Like if one of them is going to get lucky, and one of them is going to get the CPAP, one of them is going to get the Mitchell, and then all of a sudden, like if they're getting 90% of your running back production with the guys they got lucky with, then you're walking into a gunfight with a Jarvis Landry.
Yeah, right. And on that same episode, this is on Chasing Bananas in July, like I mentioned. Do you feel like when it comes to people picking up on it, and this actually happened to me in a league I was drafting in, where I was afraid, not afraid, but I was aware that taking Ezekiel Elliott anywhere in the draft, and it was in that same episode in July where you mentioned that players are just afraid to be the first person to take that, controversial player or iffy player, say like Ezekiel Elliott in that 7th round, because they might get, kind of blasted for it in the league. And again, I drafted him in the 9th, and I had to text on the Slack to make sure that I wasn't going to get kicked off of our own show because I had drafted Ezekiel Elliott and I didn't want to upset the Tony Pollard cult. Even though I got him in the 9th
drafted him
round.
in the 9th of a redraft league?
No, this was a dynasty league.
How do you feel about that pick would be my question.
I feel fine.
Now.
I feel like looking back on it, I feel totally fine because he was my running back 1 that I drafted in the 9th round. So I feel fine with it because I have 7 other receivers. I'm a hero QB drafter. Like I can draft a quarterback in the 1st round and wait till like round 11 to get one, and it doesn't bother me. But like it, like I feel fine about it now. But do you feel like that's an impact that something like this can actually have on someone, like now compared to when that episode was recorded?
What do you mean by impact?
Like you're drafting in a how do I reword this again without just repeating myself? You're drafting in a room with
that. Are you?
So you're drafting in a room with a bunch of people that like to draft 0 RB, say Jacob, for example. Yeah. And now the first person to take a running back is just getting absolutely roasted. Do you think that is part of a reason why people don't want to draft 0 RB, or that it has such a combative approach? Sorry if I had to reword that.
I don't know if you've ever watched Ship Chasing, Tom.
Yeah. It's you're saying there's like a social aspect to it.
Yes.
I guess I just don't worry about that too much personally. I mean, probably that's part of why. I mean, there's definitely a lot of people that are heavy in 0 RB that take it too far. I mean, if you ask me, Zeke in the 9th round was probably close to efficient. Like, I don't think that was like a crazy value. Like, I think you probably got him where he should have gone. Like, I don't think,
right.
And so to me, it's this element of like when I'm in those drafts, I might, if I was in that extreme of a draft, I might have considered Zeke at that point too. There's going to be a point where I'm going to be like, you know what? I think this is efficient. I just look at drafts as inefficient personally. Like I just am like these, and then everyone else is doing it that way. And they're not going to stop as we get more and more 0 RB. If it gets like, I don't think we're anywhere close to efficient yet, but if we got to efficient drafting, maybe I would have to reconsider my thoughts. But like, that's one of the things with Anti-Fragility is kind of one of the points I was trying to make about 0 RB at the beginning. When it was written in 2013, is like not all the exact same elements of what Sean wrote in 2013 apply in 2022. And he's sort of updated over the years, talked about the concept of this Uber back and how he would apply that. And it's still the same tenets and doing things differently. But if you want to be anti-fragile, one of the biggest things is you have to know the market now. Like you can't, everyone. I've seen it used to be just targeting young players, right? Like it was like too easy to get rookies and second year players. Everyone is a lot more comfortable targeting rookies and second year players. It's one of those things where once everyone catches on, now you have to figure out the next thing. So, I mean, I don't think the Zeke pick was like a bad pick or anything like that. You have to be able to adapt to the new landscape as it changes and as things evolve. And so what makes sense from an anti-fragile perspective might not be 0 RB if we were in drafts like that everywhere and consistently, right? Then we'd have to try to consider other ways to build teams. I mean, and one of the things I talked about in ship chasing a little bit earlier this offseason was I felt like certainly the quarterbacks have been going too high in early best ball drafts. I felt like there was a lot of receivers that were undervalued that were going way too late, like outside the window that I would take receivers often in August, because I'm usually like pretty much done by round 10 and I'm starting to load up on running backs. Maybe I've taken 1 or 2 backs by that point, but I'm starting to hit running backs in 11, 12, 13, 14, or I'm hitting a tight end or Q if I haven't yet or whatever. But I thought there was a lot of receivers in that range that basically by August, I think will be in the top 10 rounds. And so because of that, now I'm going to work back to front a little bit. I have a little more leeway, I think, in the earlier rounds to potentially take some running backs. And so I felt like the early best ball season ADP was inefficient, and I felt like inefficient for different ways. It was creating different clusters of player value, and it made me think to approach the goals that I want to approach from a team building perspective, that it might mean that I would take some running backs in the dead zone, frankly. And
I agree.
The drafts I was doing that.
I drafted Josh Jacobs in 5 of my first 10 drafts, which felt ridiculous, but it's just, I looked at it. I was like, but specifically it was because there was rookie receivers that were going, Jahan Dotson was opened in the round 18. I was like, that's ridiculous. This guy's probably going to be a first round pick or an early second. George Pickens was basically free. We didn't even have the combine. So there, I felt like we could just take educated shots on guys like Sky Moore, Khalil Shakir, Wan'Dale Robinson, David Bell. Let's just see who's going to have a good combine. Let's just take shots. And and
the other element of that is
normally you're taking wind sprinters at wide receiver.
Right. You're taking bad players.
Not,
Totally. And the other element of that is we don't know in the 12, 13, 14 round running back range what's going to happen with these depth charts, because that's such a huge part of it. In August, it's pretty easy to know what the good 0 RB targets are. It's harder in January, February, and March because free agency shakes it up, right? We just saw little things. J.D. McKissick move. That's going to change the way that we evaluate both the backfields, right? Washington and Buffalo. James Conner and Chase Edmonds, I thought were great values early. We talked about on Stealing Bananas. They're going to rise now because we have Edmonds leaving and Conner staying. Point being, running backfield so unsettled, value so unsettled. It's tough to know who to target in those 12 to 14 ranges. It's pretty easy to get total zeros in your drafts. Trying to do a 0 RB. I wasn't doing a lot of 0 RB early off season. I almost never am, but I completely agree with the rookie receivers were out of control.
Ben, we've kept you for 100 minutes of your time, and especially for those of us that are not on Pacific time.
But before you get to this last topic, I gotta say, you sent me the show sheet. And I looked through it and I was like, all of these topics could be 2 hours. They could be at least a full hour. I'm saying this as a compliment because I think you're on all of the right stuff and you want to talk about a lot of good stuff. That's why I'm happy to stick around and keep chatting. These are fun conversations to me. This is the types of stuff that people should be thinking about and talking about.
Well, I'll put it this way. If you ever choose to come and do a podcast again, I'm happy to expand on more topics. So certainly I tried to pack what I could into the show sheet, but that does not mean that this that we never get this opportunity again for sure. I will. We should wrap shortly. I'll do the one last question that I had, and I'll try not to take a full hour on it. But yeah, my last question. We've talked a lot about targets per route run. I have 2 more guys specifically I really wanted to talk about, which were Kadarius Toney is one that I'm super interested in your take on, because I thought he had a rancid prospect profile, and I've found myself buying a lot of him recently, just based on a guy who flashed potential target earning and just has like a ridiculously wide range of outcomes. I think like possibly the widest of anyone. And then Gabe Davis is another guy that's interesting. And just in general, like what do we make of these guys with like high targets per route? Well, Gabe Davis isn't high, but higher, but way lower route shares. Like what do we make of the translatability of these guys? Because I probably got a little burned last year chasing some of this with Claypool, with Chenault, where it was guys who were earning like pretty solid targets per route, was hoping to get full routes. Chenault just never really did. Claypool did, and then started earning less targets. Again, these are two guys. So like we shouldn't be making assumptions for going forward based on a couple of guys, but like, do we think that these guys with these partial route shares, high targets per route, do we think that's something that's translatable?
I do. Yeah. I mean, I think there's definitely context. One of the things that I'm starting to learn more as I dig more into targets per route run, and it's only been the last kind of couple of years, is there's 5 guys in a route on a given play, right? There's 5 ineligible linemen. There's a quarterback. There's 5 guys in a route. The other 4 dudes in the route matter, right? And so I talked about this a little bit with Russell Gage. Like when the other 4 guys are all bad at earning targets, somebody has to get the targets, right? And then flip side, when there's these offenses where there's a bunch of dudes that have shown an ability to dominate targets, you get Antonio Brown thrown in with Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. Naturally, it's going to reduce the rate that Mike Evans and Chris Godwin are earning targets per route. I mean, it's just that makes sense, right? And so we have a small sample and we have to factor in like a lot of various things. With Tony, like his targets per route run in the small sample was massive. It was also at times in offenses where like everyone was hurt, right? And so they were just kind of like throwing him the ball every time. I went back and looked at his college targets per route run. They weren't really like awful, very small samples there too, because he played other positions. But like I remember all the way back to like Braxton Miller, who was a QB turned receiver that people were sort of somewhat comparing to Tony. Braxton Miller like had no receiver value. At least Tony had in college had some routes and showed every year that he got some routes. He was over 20% targets per route run, which in college to be a prospect you need to be. But he was over 22% every year. He was at least able to earn some volume. And then we see in the pros he's earned some volume. The way that I think the targets per route run stuff is super important because I think the ability to earn the volume, like the efficiency side is much less predictable. The ability to earn the volume is a skill, and it's that's how we know that a receiver's good and has a ceiling is their ability to earn like massive volume. Like I've really, really dove into targets per route run as this edge right now, I guess, in the fantasy world where it's not caught on enough yet. People love yards per route run. I remember I did a thread a couple of years ago and was like, yards per out run is literally just targets per out run and yards per target. And people hate yards per target. The only difference is targets per out run. That's the part that has the signal. I showed that it's a lot more stable year over year. And then I think like the end of the thread, I was like, conclusion, if you're using yards per out run, you should just be using targets per out run because you hate the yards per target side of it anyway. Right. You should just use targets per, and then everyone started using it a lot more. It was really funny. I had like not seen it very much anywhere, but I'm seeing it in a lot of places now, which is good. But it's not caught on enough, and people I don't think are aware enough that it's a really good way of driving home what a receiver's range of outcomes are, because it is a pretty stable receiver stat, and the ability to earn targets is so important. But anyway, to get back to your point, yes, in small samples and with these massive targets per out run like Kadarius Toney, as I increase his routes to a huge amount, I'm not going to necessarily say that he can keep hitting 27% targets per out run. At the same time, I think he's shown that skill. And so this is like the exact type of player that I want to target, where people who are looking at target share still are not like, I think targets per out run is better than target share. I know that. I
agree.
To be clear, I know that Mike Leone, one of my good buddies, who I think does some of the absolute best in-season projections, focuses way more on target share. And we've had a lot of discussions about this. And so like there are people that will tell you that target share is more predictive. He's done research on that.
Yes. And I think that there's a major caveat with that, but I don't want to cut you off.
No, you're good. You're good. I mean, I think one of the major caveats is like the route side, and like the really good players are running a lot of routes, and the routes can fluctuate and things. But when we're looking at individual players, I can look at Kadarius Toney and say, this guy has a target earning skill and he didn't run a lot of routes. And if that expands, now I know, like, again, small miss, big hit type stuff. It's not hard to tell myself a big hit outcome for a guy who already showed 27% targets per out run upside on 200 routes. I do think that's going to come down, but I'm willing to make bets on that. Like I'm willing to, like it's a very small sample, but like that's a positive, right? Gabe Davis is another dude you mentioned. Not necessarily great targets per out run. Obviously a downfield profile, which is harder to earn targets. You know, he's got the ADOT. I have the weighted targets per out run that I look at. His weighted targets per out run pretty strong. And he's been efficient as well, which like the yards per target stuff, not necessarily sticky, but there are players that are consistently able to be efficient. And a lot of them are the ones that get the air yards, right? They're downfield guys that are able to, you know, when they bring in passes, they're able to get a lot of yards on those targets. So that's going to naturally lead to higher yards per target. His range of efficiency is higher, but he was also a dude in college who was really good, had strong targets per out run. So I go back to that. I look at Gabe Davis. I'm like, part of the reason there's all this hype is that 4 touchdown game. Prior to that, we should have probably been hyped as a guy whose routes had been limited, as sort of a late round pick, wasn't a lot of draft capital. They weren't giving him his opportunity, had to earn his way his rookie year, doesn't get the red carpet rolled out for him a year 2, and earns his way onto the field again and is good, is efficient, is good. Maybe not a target dominant player, but he's earned his way multiple times. It reminds of Adam Thielen. It reminds of another dude that I think you're a fan of, Jacob, but Jacoby Myers is a guy that I've
fucking loved Jacoby Myers.
I've compared to apparently a lot of you are.
First of all, it's his name like mine with an I, and he wears my number from childhood. So, like, how can I not love a guy who's Jacoby and wears 16? But he also is good.
But he always has had, you know, solid targets per out run in small samples. He's had to earn his opportunity multiple times. Even in 2020, they didn't start him out. Even after a good rookie year, 2019, they didn't start him out as a starter. 2020, barely played the first half of the year. Then he earns his way back onto the field, and he's their main guy down the stretch. 2020, 2021, first time we've seen the guy run a full year of routes. But that's the upside. All of a sudden is like, okay, this guy's shown us the target ability. He keeps flashing. I feel like Gabe Davis might have that type of upside in year 3 where he actually gets the full routes. He's shown the weighted targets is the side that I would say for him because he's got the air yards.
Do you think he could be like a Mike Williams, like 20% target share on a 11 ADOT, like that kind of?
Yeah, I think it's a great comp. Yeah, and the red zone element of it too. Like Williams has had his TDs bounce around, but Davis has had a strong red zone roll over his last couple of years.
And I'm assuming that changes. Obviously, you're I guess not hype for him, but his situation, if Buffalo does go out and draft a receiver way higher, you almost throwing that out and throwing him to the wind in year 3, or is it just?
See, that's a good question, and I think probably not, because he has the good rookie profile. He has the good couple years in limited routes. He'd probably be tougher to project that next route step forward, right? So he's still in a limited role, but he becomes that sort of anti-fragile receiver in the crowded room of a good passing game that we were talking about, where someone else gets hurt. Diggs gets hurt. I mean, I was saying Gabe Davis last year on the idea that even if they weren't playing him, I was buying into the Emmanuel Sanders and everything. But if Diggs goes down, I thought Gabe Davis would have been basically their best option to have a legit receiver, because I just think Cole Beasley and Emmanuel Sanders are old, and I don't like old guys. And so it was like this idea that Gabe Davis was going to be probably their best shot at replacing that production.
I agree to an extent that I think Davis is a little overpriced now, because I think the ceiling is like a low 20s target share, high ADOT guy, which is like kind of like a Marvin Jonesy, Mike Williamsy kind of guy. But I would draft more of him, I think, if they took someone, because then there's a lot more room between his cost and that, right? Like I think his upside is like, it's like the inverse of what we just talked about with Amon-Ra, where like Amon-Ra has like pretty high target earning ceiling, lower ADOT ceiling. Like I think Davis is the opposite of that. But like I don't know that Davis is more than like a low end wide receiver 2. So it's like how much room to grow that I want to accept this risk that he gets replaced. But
I think the playoff touchdown game was like the worst thing that could happen if you were a Davis fan, because it basically just made him.
I was in on Davis after the 14 target 3 catch game against the Jets. and then the 4 touchdown game kind of fucking.
Sorensen and DeAndre Baker were determined to boost his stock so they could trade Gabe Davis off of their fantasy teams the next year. And I think Gabe Davis becomes more available if they draft somebody in the 1st and 2nd round, because the real Gabe Davis truthers will hold strong. Whereas a lot of the people that are buying in because of that game, I think his value almost resets.
Which
comes
is
back
literally what happened like last year. right?
Yeah,
He was
exactly.
like
But
hyped,
Davis-
and then he went down. And then
Davis and Tony are tough ones. It's the guys like to get back to your basic, your very first question, Jacob. Like the guys like Rondale Moore are really interesting to me. Where it's clear to me he didn't play because Kirk was in the slot. The game that he played the most last year was the game that they first had both Hopkins and AJ Green off the field, and Kirk kicked outside for one game. Kirk's slot percentage went way down, and Rondale Moore actually played more. His slot percentage was super high, so was Kirk's. They kept Kirk in the slot. They decided Antoine Wesley on the outside was going to be their answer rather than get Rondale more time. I don't know why they were making those decisions. It's probably not a good thing for Moore, but Kirk is gone now, and it seems very clear. I mean, they did re-sign Ertz, and Ertz is a slot option for them as well. But it seems very
personnel rather than 10, so there'll only be one slot receiver out there.
But it does seem pretty likely that Rondale Moore is going to see the routes bump that you want to see, and then he already had the solid targets per route run. For him, obviously, the element is, can he get any kind of air yards, right? Is he going to just be this running back type player? But like when you can tell yourself pretty comfortably this guy's going to see a big routes game, maybe it's not as clear for Gabe Davis. I think it is probably pretty clear for Kadarius Toney because of the first round draft capital and everything.
Yeah.
Maybe
the issue for him is sample size, right? Like I think with Toney, like the reason why I'm buying in is because if he had played the full year and he had stayed healthy, I think one of two things would happen. Like either he would have not earned a lot of targets over the rest of the year. We would have been like, oh, weird. He had one big game and it turns out he's a 20% player. Or he would have just kept doing it and he would be drafted in like the 4th round of startups right now. Yeah.
What was your reason for the target share being more predictive and everything? You're saying you had a good thought on that.
I think I'll kind of wrap with this. My take on like why target share is more predictive, but targets per route run is a better stat is that target share is more predictive because there's like a lot of implicit issues with translating targets per route run. So like, for instance, Rondale Moore last year is a great example. A lot of his touches were manufactured, right? So if I'm the coach and I decide like I want to call 4 jet sweeps or tap passes or screens, whatever, like these manufactured touches, like Mecole Hardman is a great example of this, where he gets a lot of manufactured touches. So like if I decide going into the game, I'm going to call 5 like manufactured shuttle passes, and then those are going to go to Mecole Hardman, like, but I'm also not making Mecole Hardman a full-time player. Well, he's on the field for the plays that I'm calling manufactured Hardman touches, and then he's not on the field for the others. So if I then put him on the field for 100% of the plays, like I'm probably not calling 3 times as many like tunnel screens. I'm just like, now he's just running routes. That being said, that's why I think it's target share is more predictive, but I don't necessarily think it's better. I think that targets per route run tells us more about what that player's possible ceiling is. And I think that we can use context to filter things out. Like, I think that we can look at a Mecole Hardman and say, okay, like 30, I know this offhand, but I'll just like, okay, like a really high percentage of this guy's targets are manufactured and he's not getting a lot of routes. And so either he's going to continue to not get a lot of routes, which is why his target share is going to be stickier, or if he does start to expand into more routes, then those manufactured aren't necessarily going to scale up and he might not earn the other kind of targets. But I think that we can do a good job of adding enough context to make targets per route run more actionable, even if it's not predictive. I think we can look at things like reception perception. I think we can watch film. I think we can use PFF grades. I think we can look and see like, okay, how is this guy winning? Like, can this guy actually win as a full-time wide receiver? Because I think if a guy shows, no, he can win as a full-time wide receiver, then I think we can a lot more confidently say, actually, no, if we expand the routes on this individual player, then his targets per route run can translate more than his target share. And so that's where I stand, where I think that targets per route run is like kind of like a better stat, even if it's not more predictive. And I think it's sometimes like we get too carried away, I think, with data where we're kind of putting the blinders on and say, okay, well, what's more predictive? But I think like we should be allowed to, and we should be encouraged to look into a little bit of like, why actually is that the case?
Yeah, because every player is a delicate little flower. I mean, that's the theme of the show. I couldn't agree with everything you just said more. The big and where you're going at the end is where I was going to go. If you did go there, but like the fantasy community has gotten way too formulaic about doing these big scale analyses and then saying this one's the most predictive. We don't have anything that's predictive enough that there's not still a really high amount of unexplained variance. You want to talk about like R-squareds and stuff. There's still a lot of unexplained variance in all these stats. Just because something's more predictive, like again, go back to yards per out run. People love that stat. It's because you're putting in the target earning element and the after the catch element, which includes some ADOT type stuff. We were just talking about how yards per target's higher for the deeper targets. Yeah, if you're going to throw everything, what is yards per route run? It's literally just yards. I mean, the only part of it the only thing that we're doing with it is we're controlling for how many routes the player runs. But for any really good player, they're running all the routes. So like ultimately all we're really just saying is like, we're doing a little bit of controlling for their playing time, for their snaps. Wide receivers
and
run
we
routes
should
on
be
every
taking contingent bets. Like we should be saying, like, I think it's worth saying this guy might not get all the routes, but what if he does? And we're going to bet on that contingent outcome because it pays us off more than the opposite.
Right.
Like, I think that's okay. Like, I think it's okay to have said last year, like, man, Deebo Samuel was used like a running back. But like he had over 2 yards per route run. He had earned a lot of targets per route run. Like we can make that bet. And obviously that one pays off. And I think it's the same reason why we can say, like, actually, no, like it was fine to take a shot on like a Laviska Shenault. It was fine to take a shot on other guys. Like the Tony thing might like totally blow up my face. Like I'm taking quite an aggressive share on Tony because I think that it was a really tiny sample. It might translate, but like he also won outside as much as he won inside on the few games that he was there. So it's like, why wouldn't he get all these routes? It could totally blow up, but I do think the fantasy community has a tendency to over focus on like why like inherently risky bets or like wide range of outcomes bets or like young players really like why the ones that we haven't seen it, why they went wrong. But like when Robbie Anderson busts or Tyler Boyd busts, like it just seems like it's like, oh, like we're not calling out like the people who drafted Robbie Anderson. We're not calling out the people who drafted Tyler Boyd. Like
because we've seen
we're
it
not
before.
calling out the people who drafted Mike Davis, but it's like, but the people who drafted Laviska, like those are a bunch of idiots. Like,
dude, the Laviska stuff on Twitter lately has been so damn funny. There are so many people that are like, and here's the thing. They were doing this last offseason after his rookie year wasn't that great. And then they were doing it in season last year when he wasn't very good. And now it's this offseason. Like, these are all the continuation of the same thing. Like, yeah, that's a miss. That's fine. You know why I don't care? Because I had a ton of Laviska both the last 2 years and had very profitable years. Like that exact thing that landed me on Viska that you just described, you're going to have misses, guys. But like that is what landed me on the players that led me to like some pretty big seasons. These are my two most profitable years of my life, frankly, the last 2 years. And the Viska thing is so funny because it's people who were always down on him and they want to let everyone know that the Viska truthers are wrong. It's like, I saw someone earlier that was like, I wonder how the Viska truthers feel about this. I'm like, I don't care. Like, I don't think it was a mistake. I'm comfortable being wrong. Like, I am totally comfortable that I was as high on Viska as I was the last 2 years. Went back and looked at his profile again recently and was like, yeah, I want to target this guy again the next time he gets drafted. The exact same profile. Yeah. I feel great about it. If I get a cheap opportunity, if he gets traded and I get a cheap opportunity to be heavy on him again this year, and I like the opportunity. I'm not going to do it if he's in Jacksonville probably, but I will probably be back in on Viska because I still think that there's enough in his profile that there's possibility this guy still pans out. I mean, after 2 years, this is the pattern matching comp, right? But like after 2 years, everyone was sure Tyler Boyd sucked, had a great prospect profile, ended up being good in year 3 and onward. After 2 years, everyone was sure Devonta Adams sucked. Everyone was sure Devonta Adams was the worst wide receiver in football. Had a great prospect profile, finally hit in year 3, has been the best receiver in football since. I mean, it was there in his Fresno State profile.
God, you're going to talk about Laviska again.
I'm not saying you need to be in on Viska. I'm not saying you need to be on Viska. But I don't care that I'm not in on it. My favorite thing is every time I read one of those tweets, they're like really aggressive too. And I'm like, you're just telling on yourself that you don't get how to find good players. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Be really, really proud of yourself for not being on Viska. It's the same process that helped me win a lot of leagues the last couple of years. And was on a lot of my teams. It was not a helpful player, but you can have misses and still win.
I think the funniest part of tweets like that and just the mentality of it all is this, for the most part, the same people will tell you that they're happy they were right on Viska will blame, process variance on, deciding not to draft Jamar Chase or deciding not to draft Kyle Pitts, when he blows up, and they'll say, well, it's just my process variance. It's whatever. Yeah. But those Shenault people, the
don't draft until you haven't seen it people didn't draft Jamar Chase last year, which that sucks.
Yeah. Once you've seen it in the NFL, you're close to the decline. You get like 3 years of production. Like that's the rule. Like, oh God.
Be predictive, not reactive is something that I say.
Don't pay constantly for past production. There's a million ways to say it. Like that's my favorite way to say it, especially from running backs. Don't pay for past production ever. Like just that's simple.
Fastest
Oh,
way to
man.
sink your team. Well, I think we're about to hit 2 hours.
My God, new record.
It has not felt like 2 hours. I feel
It
like I
hasn't.
could do this with you, Ben, for
Oh,
a while. Again, we appreciate it, but one thing we like to do before we get out of here is take things a little bit lighthearted. We want you to know, what is your favorite Seattle sports moment?
I was gonna put Seahawks, but I know you're in an emotional place right now, so I wanted to give you the option to pick Mariners or Huskies.
1 second, hold on.
Yeah.
1 second. I need to ask you a question. On your show that discussed the trade for Russell Wilson,
I listened
there
to
was
that
like
today.
a positive light about Noah Fant coming to town and how there's cap space and they can really do something with it. And then they signed Will Dissly to $7 million a year. And
My hero.
after hearing that podcast, I just want to know your first reaction to them spending their money on Will Dissly. Because as you said it, nothing is out of the picture for them.
Yeah.
I can't believe I forgot.
I'm not too worried about what that means for Fant. I mean, I think Fant's clearly the better player, and then I think it's just an indication they want to do 2 tight end sets, and so it gets back to like
they want to run the ball.
Yeah, they want to run the ball. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm like high on Fant, and it's not a good thing, but it comes back to that idea of like if they're both on the field together, which I would assume that's what that will mean to a certain degree. It's kind of like the receivers where I was saying like, 2 good receivers can be on the field together. And there's teams like people had a hard time with that with Ertz and Goddard because it's like who's the number 1 tight end. If the team's using 2 tight end sets enough, like they can both be pretty good.
I'd argue it's a good thing for everyone if Dissly's on the field because he's going to be a non-target earner. And I was going to say that too. Right? Like if there's 4 players running a route, one of them's Dissly, then he's not earning the targets. So
yeah.
I wrote. I used Dissly a lot in 2019 to win me some games while I was streaming tight end
for a couple weeks before he got hurt. That's the other thing I first thought was like this dude can't stay healthy. And I'm not like a big like health is predictive thing, or kind of guy, but like he's had a hard time staying healthy, and so. That's the other element is like I don't think he's ever going to be a guy that's going to play a ton, and Fant will be, so it's like when they do 40% 2 tight end sets, which would be a lot, but they might if they push 30 or 40%, those are Will Dissly snaps, and then Fant's still out there close to 100%, maybe not quite 100%, but hopefully still close.
I just couldn't not get that in there because
that's great.
I had heard the pod and then
it doesn't make any sense. I don't know what they're doing. No. So I actually grew up a Vikings fan, oddly enough. I think a lot of people would say their favorite Seattle sports moment because Seattle has so many just really awful moments in our sports history. Would be the Seahawks Super Bowl. I won't say that. It's certainly not the Sonics leaving. I love the Sonics growing up. There's some great Husky ones I could tell you, Husky basketball, Husky football ones. The Gus Johnson call on the Isaiah Thomas jumper in the Pac-12 tournament a few years ago made the rounds again the other day. It gives me chills every time. That's one of my all-time favorite Husky basketball moments. But I will say the 95 Mariners, Edgar Martinez hits the double down the line. Griffey scores from first, slides in. That year, but not that game. We had a play-in game that year. I was 8. I got to go to the game. And we won 9-1. We made the playoffs for the first time in however many years. And the fans rushed the field. I still have this, like, this would be my favorite Seattle sports moment. I still have this image of a dude in jean shorts getting arrested on the warning track at the Kingdom. Because he had like run out to the outfield. Most of the crowd was like in the infield, but like literally they were rushing the field. This is the 90s. I was 8 years old trying to convince my mom to let me run out onto the field. She was not having it. She pointed out the guy who got arrested. But it was an incredible game. And I remember being there, and then they went on and they won the divisional series next. And that double would have been, one of the other huge ones. But at that time, the Mariners were thinking about leaving Seattle as well, long before the Sonics left Seattle. And so it was people talk about that double as the game that saved baseball in Seattle. But for me, it was the playing game. Actually, they won 9-1. Luis Soho hit an inside the park grand slam. Basically, it was with an error. He hits like a ground ball down the first baseline. Bases loaded. Ends up getting all the way around. You guys are not baseball. This is not a baseball podcast, but
Tom is like Tom loves baseball way more than football.
I'm so happy you're talking about baseball right now.
Well,
I know what you're talking about. He little leagued it.
For the record, the origin of our show is that Tom and I met when he subbed for our slow pitch team one night. And that's how this became a podcast. So.
I could do the splits to save our shortstops bad throws,
Yeah.
and they're like, "You come every game," and now we're here.
Yeah, that's great. But yeah, man, that 95 Mariners team, Griffey. I mean, I was a kid, grew up in Seattle. Everyone, I think everyone in my generation, like when I went to college, kids from all over the country were like, "Yeah, Griffey was my favorite player growing up." Like I grew up in Seattle. Yeah. Griffey was my favorite player, like for sure.
The sweetest swing of all time.
That was when I was a kid, Mariners baseball in the 90s in Seattle that's my favorite Seattle. Those are my favorite Seattle memories for sure.
Awesome. Billy, do you have one?
Jacob was being mean to Patrick last week, so I get to do this one. We want the ball and we're going to score will always be my favorite.
I remember where it was when I saw that, dude. I was at my dad was it was my dad's wedding. My dad was getting remarried. Me and my brother are standing in like the side thing as they're like getting ready, watching the end of it. We're standing up in this room in our suits, and we're like, that's an ominous thing to say, Hasselbeck.
So amazing. I love that. Jacob, do you have one?
Man, I'm honestly struggling because I don't have like a massive affinity for Seattle sports or anything like that. But it's kind of a retroactive one where like I remember watching the Isaiah Thomas shot and I thought it was like really fun at the time. And then like I'm a Celtics fan, so I just grew to have this like massive love for IT, where he's like now one of my like 10 favorite athletes ever, probably just based on like that season that he had where he was like top 5 in potentially the MVP race, goes and has like 50 against the Wizards. Like, so all of my like Isaiah Thomas love, I have like a million just top IT experiences, and then it burned out.
Oh, so I gotta tell you something on that.
Now I rewatch like IT highlights and I make sure to include the Washington Huskies shot. So
that one was so freaking cool. But I was actually in college at that time. I was at UW, and he was a couple years younger than me, or a year younger than me, and so he went pro early, but he was the star, and I never lived in a frat or anything, but I was in the dorms, and then it ended up meeting some buddies. We ended up renting out this 16-room house my senior year. We used to have a bunch of parties there, and Thomas used to come to our parties. I remember, like, I used to like sit by him on the couch and chat with him about Husky basketball.
Who's
so, like,
taller than you or Isaiah Thomas?
I think I'm taller than him. I can't remember for sure. I think I might be taller than him. He's not a big dude.
So
yeah, I'm like 6'1". Yeah.
Oh, then
that was sort of my recollection.
5'9", so.
Yeah. But I mean, imagine being the drunk college kid and Isaiah Thomas is in your living room. I'm like, dude, I was probably so annoying. Oh my god.
Man, that must have been so cool to just like watch like as his career blossomed. Because I mean, he was like literally the last pick of the draft. Like, you probably went from like, oh, I have this cool memory of a guy who made the NBA to like, I have this cool memory of a guy who might win MVP.
Yeah, he was sweet. I mean, you can go back to I remember my high school basketball team in the state tournament played against him, and he put up like 60 points on us, 50 points on us.
Of course.
It was incredible. Yeah. Anyway.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're good. You're good.
I've had a lot of experience with either pro athletes or entertainers as a former, I guess, current professional wrestler, but I still think my favorite encounter with a pro athlete is still Ken Griffey Jr. As I believe it was around 95, 96 in Skydome. I was sitting in the center field seats talking shit to Ken Griffey Jr. as a spry 7-9-year-old, and thought I was real tough, going, Griffey, you suck, Griffey. Deep ball was hit, and I want to say it was, oh my gosh, I want to say it was someone like Sean Green-esque hit this towering home run, and I thought for sure it was gone. I'm standing up. I thought it's coming to our section, and in Skydome they have that large gap in between the seats and the wall. Ken Griffey scaled the wall, grabbed the ball, stared us down from center field to almost, I swear to God, second base, and he just held the ball. And I thought it was one of those things when he caught it and he landed, he was going to take the ball and like fake throw it in or like throw it to a fan. He gave us the big old FU, and for the rest of the game, every time the Mariners got an out, he would turn around and smile at us. I remember the Mariners won that game 10-2.
That's incredible. That's a great story.
It was absolutely phenomenal, and I'll never forget it because I have never heckled a pro athlete ever since to this day.
That's the day you learn that they're actual human beings too. Like when you're a kid, you're like, these are just like giants out here. Yeah. And then they start like reacting to you, and you're like, oh wait, that I don't want to get on that guy's bad side.
I basically lived the Simpsons Daryl Strawberry episode live with him and I know it'd be like, he wasn't just looking at me, it was that whole section was giving it to him. And he just, the way he held the ball and he like did that baseball backwards jog. I mean, just holding the ball up. I was like, that is the GOAT.
That dude was the coolest dude. Like he probably did it in the coolest way possible.
It was. It really stuck out to me. It was
also the first time you got owned.
Yeah, that was one of the earliest. Absolutely. And hey, I mean, shout out to Seattle. They got an NHL team now, so go Kraken. That's gonna do. They have sick jerseys too. The unis are very nice. Guys, that's going to do it for our show. I think we've said that like twice now, but that's going to do it for the episode 8, the Full Tilt Dynasty podcast. Obviously, everyone here has a lot of work that they have going on. So I obviously want to hear what everyone has planned. Jacob, what do you have going on?
Yeah, I took off my February writing hiatus, and that ended with 2 articles being released in 2 days. So I did my first part of my new series, Thinking About Thinking, called Prospecting with Humility. And I just talked a lot about like what are analytical prospecting models trying to do, because we get in this like film versus analytics like crazy debate, which is like a really silly dichotomy. And I just like talked in a really general sense. I talked a lot about apples and fruit trees in a metaphor, if anyone wants to hear that. And then my other piece is something very different. I talked about some of my experience working in law and in government advocacy work on gender-based violence policies, and just specifically about like how we talk about the Deshaun Watson situation for the purposes of our content, and how we do so in a compassionate way, and how we avoid like gamifying something really serious. And so if anyone wants to check that out, I also encourage you. Both of those are up on playerprofiler.com. Otherwise, I'll be just cranking out like a new one every week or two in my Thinking About Thinking series, at least leading up to the draft. You can always find me in the Bulletproof Discord, in Drew O's and Chuck's Patreon, and you can always find me here, and you can find me tomorrow night with Chase and Shane on Dynasty Intervention. We have Rich Rebar joining us tomorrow night, so it'll be a lot of fun.
Can't wait. Don't forget all that underdog content coming to Full Tilt.
Yes.
Hey, that's right. Hey. Billy, I know you're pretty excited.
Yeah, I just found out I can do it in Texas. I'm excited. I'm excited. We're clear.
Awesome. What do you got, man?
Yeah, I promised last week that I was going to start mock drafting every NFL team through the first 5 rounds, and then I went to a wedding and didn't get to do anything for a couple days. So we're going to start that up. We're starting up with the Eagles. You can always find me on Twitter at BigBillyFF, and you can find me back here tomorrow with PFF's Austin Gale. Very, very excited for that show.
That's right. That one's super stoked. And Ben, you obviously have a ton going on.
Yeah, just stealing bananas, ship chasing, and I'll probably write for my newsletter again, but my hiatus has been longer than Jacob's. I wrote a couple long run articles in February at some point. But we'll have some stuff up in the news on the Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com soon enough. But yeah, no, I'm going on a road trip, like I said. So
that's right, vacation time.
That's what I'm most excited for. I'll tell you.
So is there no stealing bananas for the next 9 days?
No, we're gonna do them through not when I'm gone. I think they're gonna run some evergreen stuff, some older stuff, and kind of repost it. That because we've gotten some requests for stuff like that, so it's a good time to do that.
It's very integral to my commuting plans that I know this kind of things ahead of time.
You're ready to hear something you may have already heard before.
Okay.
He got that inside info, and of course, you could find me over there at Thomasville FF. I'm all over the place. I'm over there doing it Trophy Smack and Fantasy Intervention, all other fun stuff. But the main focus is, of course, right here where we are back tomorrow with Austin Gale of PFF. March 22nd, we have Josh Larkey. Obviously, on Saturday, we're going to be back with the Fantasy Walkabout, taking a spiritual journey through our fantasy values with our mate from around the world, Tom Lee. Guys, I couldn't have been happier to have this show. I think I learned more in this 2 hours than I could have possibly have fathomed. I'm going to question a lot of my tactics, and I obviously have a lot more to go and read that I didn't ahead of time. I always like to end the show the exact same way, and it's really simple, right? Be kind to one another. Don't be a pile of human garbage. Definitely don't be a giant piece of shit. Check in on your loved ones because you never know when they need them. I can't wait for Baker to get traded so I can absolutely trash that he failed as a first-round draft pick.
I can't do it.
What's that?
I can't. If he's a Colt, I don't know. I'm gonna feel.
I cannot wait for Baker or Jimmy.
As long as whoever they have to, like, my take on the Colts quarterback situation has been the same. The only way that they repeat the mistake of last year is giving too much for replacement level value. If they get Baker, I'm fine with it. If they trade like a bunch of picks for Baker that inhibits them from being able to find an actual difference maker later, then I'll be on a watch list.
I love that, man. Like I said, check it on your loved ones because you never know when they need it, especially when they get a new franchise quarterback. Guys, always remember that clear eyes and full hearts can never lose, and that your best days, well, they're always spent tilting. Good night, everybody.
Clear eyes, full hearts. Can't lose.